Okay, I want to welcome you to the first Israeli conference on philosophy of AI. And I'm Erez Firt, academic manager of the Center for Humanities and AI. And this conference came together through a collaborative effort with my colleagues, Dr. Liat Lavi from the Bezalel Academy, and David Ron Yaakov from the philosophy department. And I also want to thank Ahlam Salame, the philosophy department administrator, and Professor Arnon Keren for their invaluable help. And thank you. So the idea for this conference actually came last year during the annual philosophy conference of the Israeli Philosophical Association, which actually took place right here in this venue. And we noticed that the philosophy of AI session was absolutely packed with people. So this inspired us to create something new, a dedicated space for exchanging ideas about the theoretical, philosophical, conceptual, ethical, and social implication and dimensions of AI technology. And this kind of forum feels particularly important right now, when public opinion and technological development and even regulation is primarily shaped by industry leaders and technological researchers. So I guess we'll have a lot of opportunities to discuss this during the sessions, and between the sessions and the presentations. And at this time, I would like to invite Professor Meir Chemo. Professor Chemo serves as the Vice Rector of the University of Haifa, a co-chair of the Center for Humanities and AI, and a Professor of Philosophy at the department here at Haifa.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Erez, for organizing all this and initiating the idea, also with the other people that you mentioned. It's a pleasure to open this one-day workshop about philosophy of AI. It is indeed our intention to develop especially the linkage between AI and other areas in the humanities, as this is part of what we try to do in the center. And especially when one thinks about AI, it seems that philosophical questions almost immediately invite themselves. Actually, the term AI, artificial intelligence, is already a bit, at least intuitively, a bit puzzling or so. I noticed, looking at in Google this morning, I noticed that the term AI was coined by a professor in Dartmouth College 2 years after Turing's death, and where he was organizing a conference or something about artificial intelligence, where the idea was, as far as I understood, was to investigate the question of whether machines can think. So I guess that part of some aspects of the question will come up in the various talks that you will have today in the conference, in the workshop. So yes, it is questions about Turing test as a test for intelligence. Perhaps even a test for consciousness. Putnam proposed a variation on the idea of a Turing test as a test for referring, for intentionality, and there are lots of issues come up in this context. The question of behaviorism as also invites itself when one thinks about the behavior of machines as compared to the behavior of humans, and many other questions. So I think that looking at the program, there are many interesting topics that will come up, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of them. So I wish you a very interesting and fruitful day, and that's it. Have fun.
Okay, so now Professor Arnon Keren, the head of the Department of Philosophy here at Haifa, will also say a few words.
Thank you, Erez. Thank you, Meir. And hello, everyone. I'm pleased and honored to welcome you all to the first Israeli conference of the philosophy of AI, organized by the Center of Humanities and AI that operate jointly at the University of Haifa and the Technion, together with the University of Haifa Philosophy Department. And I'm especially glad to see so many people here. And I do hope this means that the first Israeli conference on the philosophy of AI would be followed by the second and third and so forth. Philosophers observing technological developments have often noted with dismay and concern that technologies tend to develop much more rapidly than our thinking about them. And what was true about familiar technological development some 20, 30, 100 years ago has been brought to the extreme with the recent development of artificial intelligence. As you may know, AI applications are able to do today what many of us couldn't even imagine a machine doing some 3 or 5 years ago. But one context in which people have imagined machine doing some of the things that artificial intelligence technologies are able to do today is within philosophical reflection on some of the most fundamental concepts: intelligence, understanding, consciousness, agency, responsibility. Meir mentioned some of these concepts and some of the contexts in which they were imagined. In other words, conceptual challenges that some 10 or 15 years ago were merely of interest to philosophers have become the focus of actual social concern because of the development of artificial intelligence. This is one reason why there is such an important place for philosophical reflection on the AI revolution that we are currently witnessing, and why philosophical thinking about artificial intelligence is interesting, but also important and urgent. The conference today brings together diverse perspectives that reflect on these profound questions, some ethical, some conceptual, some epistemological. And I want to thank the organizers who initiated this meeting and who have worked hard to organize it and to bring a wonderful group of speakers here. I want to thank those speakers who came here to present their philosophical work on these interesting questions. I want to thank everyone who helped in the organization of this conference. So first and foremost, of course, the organizing committee, Liat, Erez, and David, and also some people from the department who helped, Ahlam and Otanu, and of course the Center for AI and Humanities that helped financially. And of course, all of you for coming to participate in the discussion. I look forward to a productive and interesting day of discussion, and welcome you all. Thank you.
Hi everyone. My name is Liat Lavi. I am both thrilled and honored to have our keynote speaker, Joanna Bryson, with us. Joanna Bryson is an academic recognized for broad expertise on intelligence, its nature, and its consequences. Holding 2 degrees in psychology and AI, BA Chicago, Master's and MPhil in Edinburgh, and PhD at MIT, Bryson is since 2020 the Professor of Ethics and Technology at the Hertie School in Berlin, where she is a founding member of the Center for Digital Governance. From 2002 to 2019, she was computer science faculty at the University of Bath. She has also been affiliated with Harvard Psychology, Oxford Anthropology, the Mannheim Center for Social Science Research, the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, and the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy. Bryson advises governments, corporations, and NGOs globally, particularly on AI policy. Her research has appeared in venues ranging from Reddit to Science. It presently focuses on the impact of technology on human societies and corporations, and improving governance on AI and digital technology. The talk of Joanna's paper that she's gonna, the title of Joanna's talk today is going to be Transparency, Accountability, and Science, AI as a Case Study in Moral Agency. So thank you, Joanna. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. As I understand, this is only a half-hour keynote, and then we're going to do a Q&A afterwards. So it's like a relatively quick talk over these themes because I had to look at the outline for the whole meeting, and I'm sorry that world events don't allow me to be there. But anyway, so that, yeah, okay, sorry. I'm also seeing, it would be awesome if you could somehow let me have a camera like that lets me see people's faces instead of the backs of their heads. So I had a, yeah, is there a way to, yeah, thank you, but I'm not seeing, is there a way like maybe on the laptop on the front, you could like turn it around so I could see people's responses? That would be more useful than seeing the backs of their heads. Yeah, you can work on that on the side. I'll keep going. Okay, so this talk is about moral agency, but via most of the focus is going to actually be on the transparency and accountability part and what we can do to actually support transparency and accountability. But I will come through and talk about sort of human responsibility and things like that. Okay, so yes, I'll try to get going. Hello. Yeah. Okay, so what is transparency? A lot of people push back on transparency, or they say that, you know, AI is necessarily some kind of a black box that you can't possibly know anything about because it has trillions of synapses just like brains, and obviously people are never transparent, right? So what I think people are starting to understand now is that transparency means something like legibility, that we can actually understand what's going on. So there has to be sufficient information about a system such that at least some humans can behave responsibly when participating in and deploying that system. All right. Now, this is actually now what the EU's AI Act requires, that you have enough information about how the system is working if you're the deployer or the activator. Great, fantastic. Thank you so much. That's great. Okay, so I can see you guys now. So warning, at least some of you. Okay, so what sufficiency is varies a lot by role. When I say some people, we need to know that users can safely use it, but that the information they need to do that is a little different from what an engineer needs if they're going to actually maintain the system, ensure that it has ongoing, you know, cybersecurity, for example, safely and correctly install it. And then finally, of course, what most of the legislators worry about is the law. So they want to be able to show liability. Did you do due diligence when you set it up? Did you actually follow best practice? And this is just the same for AI as for any other artifact. Nobody just conceives of an algorithm and poof, it appears in front of them, right? It isn't actually the AI, you put a bunch of data somewhere and then magically overnight, like Rumpelstiltskin, it turns into AI. Always there's somebody who's making decisions about which data, how it's used, how the system's architected, what it's connected to, what its capacities are. And there is good practice about how do you do those things. So it's just like any other kind of manufacturing, really. And that it's taken us years to get to the point where at least one global region is treating it that way. So I actually got known. Are you hearing this? I don't know. It's not. The sound is not actually that useful. I'll turn it off. Yeah. But the point is, I actually got known for transparency back when I was doing my PhD, although we didn't call it that then. My PhD was in the systems engineering of AI, and my concern was making it easier for people to understand how to program AI, because nobody was working on that. It was basically, you can read my dissertation as part of the Agile revolution that happened at that time with object-oriented design and things like that. And what you saw here was that relatively recently, we took the stuff that I did to make it easier to build human-like AI, quote unquote, we exposed the development tools to ordinary users, and it turned out that massively improves their understanding of the robot system itself. Which, interestingly, it didn't mean that they stopped using anthropomorphic terms on it, but it did mean that they used them in a less naive way. So they didn't perfectly understand the robot, but they now could see that, for example, it's holding still, that it was thinking, that there was decision making being made, right? So anyway, this was done in the context of the MIT COG project, at least initially. I wasn't on it for that long. But while I was on it, the robot looked like this. And people kept coming up to me and saying, oh, it'd be unethical to unplug that robot. And it wasn't a robot. It was like a pile of motors, right? It didn't work. It wasn't even plugged in. So there was no way to unplug it, right? And so this is when I actually started getting known also for AI ethics. I put out a paper. Well, it took me years to get the paper published, but I was trying to understand why people had too high of expectations and too high of fears for AI if it kind of looked like a person, right? So maybe if we're worried about anything, we shouldn't be worried about ChatGPT. We should be worried about Google search or something, right? Like, how do we know that that's working correctly? Well, we can pretty much tell. But anyway, you get the idea. So the point is that I've wound up learning about anthropomorphism, which is sort of the flip side of dehumanization, right? So that a lot of the people that were highly concerned about this robot and what its experiences weren't concerned about other robots that weren't shaped like people but actually worked, that were actually plugged in and things, like that one, the insect robot, right? So it even was sort of biomorphic, but it wasn't anthropomorphic. And they also weren't concerned about like homeless people sleeping in the streets. That literally there were people in front of MIT at that time. It was the 90s. And that wasn't a concern to some of the same people that worried about the robots. And so it's very, very interesting that people will put this is called moral patience. They'll believe that they have obligations to some things that look like people and not other things that look like people. So I'm still doing this stuff a little bit. I shouldn't be, actually. This was an outreach of a project that should have finished in COVID times, but I just sort of left the robot online. In fact, the robot's in the room, but I decided to stick it out of the picture. Just to say, we are still finding interesting engagement sometimes by adding the transparency information. Other people do stay engaged, but they also increase their understanding, and that's great. But that's not really the point of my talk. I want to talk a lot more about responsibility, right? So what is the point of transparency, right? Well, this is a little bit of a conjecture, but it's built on some of the newer theories about human rights. So the conjecture, after spending decades arguing with people that were transhumanists that really wanted the robot itself to be, I got it. I mean, the point of the COG project was we were trying to build like a 2-year-old, right? So I was one of those people that said, hey, what would it take to build something that's like a person? And, I was a big sci-fi fan and everything. But the more you try to reason about it, the more you see problems. So my argument here is that responsibility is the defining relationship between moral agents. So literally, it isn't that there's it's an extra thing. It's just that what we are when we're a society is a group of people that have expectations about each other. And those expectations that we're willing to enforce, that we would extend and punish if they were violated, that's what responsibility is, right? And so we aren't a society if we don't have that kind of relationship where we can depend on each other and we enforce that dependency. All right. So that's a conjecture. It's not the normal definition of responsibility, although it's not completely novel either. Some people come up with things similar. And then the interesting thing is that when I was a kid, rights were seen, generally speaking, as to be sort of a compensation for enforced responsibilities. And now this goes back to like the Romans, right? The Roman law sort of said, because remember that thing about why is it that people don't care about the people sleeping from the street? Normally, or psychologically, we tend to think that a moral patient is something that's like weak, like a baby. And that as you become a moral agent, as you become able to do things, you get responsibilities and you get less patiency. But the Roman law sort of like got realpolitik and said, no, the law basically protects those that can enforce it, right? And so that's the that was the idea of rights. It's not that you don't have any other kinds of obligations, but rights in particular were the kinds of things that were due to the other members of the legal society, right? So that is not the way everyone thinks about rights now. Now we talk about rights in terms of things like rights of the child, rights of the ecosystem, rights of the planet. And these are not things that we can argue have responsibilities. And so I'm going to give a quick overview of kind of thinking about rights and regulation in governments, and really starting with sort of a straw man. But in the ancient days, we sort of thought that government was something where somebody rode up on a horse waving a sword or something, but you can't draw a sword with AI. But this is supposed to be Bodicea riding up with a sword in the style of Egon Schiller. Okay, so somebody rides up and says, guess what? Good news, the neighbors are not going to be bothering you as much anymore. Bad news, you have to pay me for that. And that was kind of how we saw it. It was some kind of a contract that was struck, maybe enforced by someone with more power than you, but there was some kind of a contract. They did something for you as well as so that they had some kind of legitimacy, so you were likely to do what they said. Right. In the 18th century, that concept kind of got largely replaced by this idea that was, you can tell from my accent, I grew up in America. There was this idea that, we hold these truths self-evident, all men are created equal, and they have these certain kinds of obligations. The governments have to allow them to pursue happiness and things, right? So there was this idea that actually governments have these obligations. But the interesting thing is that, at least if you go back to the United States, our Constitution version 2.0, the one that's currently in action, and also that has all those amendments that are known as the Bill of Rights, all of those rights are negative rights. They're all things that the government doesn't stop you from doing, right? So there's an infinite number of things that the government cannot do. There's no resource cost to allowing people to freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, right? Those things aren't costly. Much more recently, in the last sort of 75, 80 years, we all signed up, every single country in the world signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And under that, we have other things, these positive rights. So for every single person within the border of a country, however they got there, we're obliged to make sure that they have food, that they have shelter, that they have security, that they have a job, that they have medical care, right? So on the one hand, there aren't a lot of countries that are meeting the obligations they've signed up to. But on the other hand, you have limited resources. And so you can't give everybody in your country quadruple bypass surgery or something like that that's really expensive, right? And if you did do that, then you might not be able to give them the food and shelter part, right? And so again, it's coming from America, which was founded, even if you feel like you're an atheist, you self-identify as an atheist, it's still founded by fundamentalists. So we tend to think how could it be that there's rights, people are talking now about a right to the internet. How could it be that there's rights that didn't even exist a few years ago? And how could there be that there's these tensions? So this was kind of problematic to the way I was used to thinking, which doesn't mean it's wrong. Sometimes we just learn, right? But then I came across another set of theories, which I really liked, and it was interesting. So this is a book that was actually sort of critical thinking about whether the UK should stay in the European human rights arrangement, but which I think it should actually. However, in this case, it's a little different. The question here is, what really are rights? And they had this other framing, which is that everyone who's inside of a state constitutes that state. Right? So not so different from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the difference here is one difference is that we don't see the government as something that rides in on a horse from somewhere else. Rather, we think that governments are the means by which we all coordinate our interests, everybody that's within that region. Now, of course, some people have more power than others, but basically that's the way that we see it. And I liked this because I've been arguing with a lot of tech people who basically saw governments as just interfering with their lives, and which is bizarre. Why do you think we have governments, right? The other sectors that are more established understand that you use the government to protect your interests, to try to keep your sector, keep your sector running, and to in fact increase your access to resources you need, including well-educated public, things like that. So under this kind of framing, rights are not something that's perfectly discoverable, like there's only a certain absolute level of them. Rather, they're kind of something that's negotiated and optimized. So this, you can understand this when you're thinking about what happened in COVID, right? So your right to health was in conflict with your right to freedom of movement in a different way than usual. And I believe that Israel is one of the places, at least early in COVID, that actually had fewer deaths than usual because everybody was staying home, right? And there was a few like Scandinavian countries like that too, where it was mostly car accidents. I don't know, but because they did a really good job of that trade-off, they were able to protect themselves, or we were all able to protect ourselves from the worst possible impacts of the COVID epidemic. So I like this because it's a less adversarial model of government, and I think it could help people better understand what we're trying to do when we regulate. But trust me, every single government wants innovation. Well, maybe not every single government. The vast majority of successful governments want innovation, and they want to see the economy expand, and they want to see their industry flourish. And even they want to see industries with whom they trade flourish, especially from their allies. All right, so the accountability of this is sort of the point then of transparency, right? It's not that transparency isn't the point in itself. The only thing transparency is doing is facilitating the accountability so we can maintain the responsibility. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about doing, that we can do with or without government as a coordinator. All right, so talking a little bit about what the EU has done, a lot of people got very excited about this thing. Oh my gosh, the AI Act, we've switched it from an ongoing thing into an adopted thing. And we also very recently in geopolitics, eliminated something called the AI Liability Directive. But anyway, there's a lot of noise around that, and I'll talk about if you want in Q&A, we can talk about the liability directives. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I actually like the fact, as you might see, there's the revised product liability directive that's already been fixed, which probably already covers AI adequately. I was really impressed by the changes they made to it. But anyway, what I will talk about is that I don't think the AI Act is that big of a deal, although I'll mention it. But I think that the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Acts are actually the big deal, which used to be news to people. But recently, when Donald Trump was first getting inaugurated, he already said, oh, if you guys apply the DSA, we're going to stop providing you with security, which I thought was a bit extreme, but we've seen a lot of extreme things in the last few weeks. Anyway, coming back to the EU, a lot of stuff started with the General Data Protection Regulation. And I just want to be clear about sort of what's going on. Before there were airplanes, nobody talked about airspace, right? It just wasn't a problem. But then when there's airplanes, we really, really started to care about airspace, because almost I think it was like within 3 or 4 years of flight, people were dropping bombs with them, unfortunately, at World War I. So now we started realizing that when people have our data, they can also manipulate it. Our data is basically an extension of ourselves. And so whether or not everybody cares equally about that extension of themselves, governments are starting to realize it's not good to be able to have your citizens be manipulated from the outside. And so both to defend those of us who do want to not have people have huge amounts of advantage over us and like persuade us to go into gambling or some other kinds of behaviors that are against our interests, but also to defend their democracies. A lot of people have put in data protection regulations. It's important to understand that GDPR is not like, the EU is not trying to regulate the world. It's trying to protect stuff that happens within its own borders. So it's trying to make sure that EU residents don't come to harm and manipulation. And in order to do that, it created this lovely act that actually created, as part of that, I mean, why that all happened was the same act also gave companies access to 28 nations, like a very wealthy market. And so it made it easier to do business. It's really weird that people still talk about, and there's some reasons for that, about the regulatory sort of disruptive people with unnecessarily complicated pop-up screens and stuff. But basically, the thing that absolutely helped us explode the size of the digital economy in the EU, both to the benefits of EU companies and to external companies. The economy doesn't tend to be zero sum; it tends to be win-win. So in this case, well, a bit of both, right? But anyway. So, right. So anyway, the point is the GDPR was a lot better than people say, but the point is that we're just trying to protect our democracy. And so the Digital Services Act is one of the main ways we're doing that. So when we saw what happened with Brexit and the 2016 election in the United States, we started wanting to make sure that we understood whether or not digital technology was using personal data in an appropriate way. So the Digital Services Act is primarily about how you're being profiled, how recommendations are being served to you, and how targeted advertisements are being served to you. And just making sure, because literally after Brexit, even though it was a law in the UK, which was still in the EU at the time, but after the Brexit referendum, there was no way to go back and see the advertising that had been served to people, even though it was mandatory to maintain records of political advertisement. Somehow the digital stuff was not taken care of. So this is a law, and it's not only the EU that's done it. A bunch of places like Australia, Costa Rica, Brazil, a lot of places now are saying we want to have records about what's being served and how it's being served, right? And that's really difficult because obviously there's a lot of personal data involved in that too, but lots of people are figuring out how to do a good job of it. And the tech companies used to say it was impossible, but then when it became the law, a lot of them started doing it. So yeah, ensuring fair elections and customized. Yeah, I sort of said that. Okay, the Digital Markets Act, I'm not going to go into very much here, well, a little bit later, but just to be clear, one of the hard parts, so originally there was only one act, and they took the hardest parts and they put it in the Digital Markets Act because they didn't think they'd get it through the Parliament, and both got through Parliament, which is cool. So it's a little bit uneven about what's stuck in the Digital Markets Act. But the main thing is that the US wasn't enforcing antitrust in its digital markets, and that was problematic. And a huge amount of power was being accumulated by individuals and corporations. Now, in the 19th century, the US had a bunch of crises. They got walloped by their colonial power in 1812. And then they had a horrific civil war. And then people they had all this new technology, like rails and telegraphs and things, and people started accumulating huge amounts of power, right? And then they thought, well, maybe democracy doesn't work, and in particular, maybe is it possible to have more power than a democratic government can manage? And at first they were looking for, is it like bad big companies? And then they realized there was no way to define, again, if we're having problems with democracy, you can't define which are the bad ones. It's just, no, there shouldn't be anything that's too powerful. So mostly people think about this as being a way to break things up. But in fact, in the rules, there's other rules which are that, well, some things, it makes sense to be big, like the water, the telegraphs, the rail. You still want some competition, but you have to realize that it doesn't make sense to have too much competition. And therefore, the government has to weigh in more, right? So the idea was that where you want to keep the market competitive, if you can, and that will help make sure there's good behavior. You always have a little bit of regulation helping out. But in general, this is what you do. However, if it's a natural monopoly, then you have less competition, so you need more governance. So it's like, again, a trade-off, okay? So the AI Act is relatively boring next to that. It's just a thing that talks about what I just mentioned before, the product law. So finally, we say, look, it's the digital products, even if they're performing a service, they're still a product, right? And that they have to do, best practice. And this is the way, there's a lot of myths out there. Oh, you can't possibly regulate because it's moving too fast, Some of the transhumanists are saying, like, the accelerationists are like, oh, government is going to fail anyway, because the climate crisis is coming and AI changes too fast and we can't possibly keep up. It's like, look, government is set up so that it is enforcing the knowledge of the people. First of all, by the definition I gave you before, we're all going to have to figure out some way to coordinate. So however we coordinate, that's going to be a government, right? But secondly, the race to keep up, like product law is one of the ways what we do is we say, whatever the sector has figured out works, we're going to say, especially the largest companies have to follow the best practice. So we're just enforcing the stuff that the sector itself is publishing, right? So we don't have to keep changing the laws. It's just a big myth, all right? Okay, so I promised some science. So this is literally science. And this is what, it drives me insane, actually. A lot of people think that this is all there is to bias. In fact, I actually was at a meeting recently with some people from Africa. One woman was from South Africa, and she was saying, we've come to this conclusion that the whole problem of AI ethics is that European languages have gender in them. It's just like, well, you know, I get that, you know, and there's a lot of people that talk about bias in gender or race or whatever quite often, but I don't think this is all there is to AI ethics. But nevertheless, it was a really important thing that we showed that the implicit biases, we were able to use AI not only to show the implicit biases were contained in AI, but then because it was all captured in the word embeddings, we were able to check where those implicit biases came from. So there have been a lot of theories about that. And one of the theories was it's just basically our describing reality, and that turned out to be true. Now, that was funny because that was a conservative theory. And this, normally I work with papers with more diverse, well, these guys were from diverse backgrounds, but they weren't, we were all kind of on the left. We're like, oh no, the right is correct. But anyway, let's just talk about what this graph is. The dots are the names of jobs that were in the US labor market. And the y-axis is the same word embeddings that were repeating these horrible implicit biases, right? And the x-axis on the bottom here was actually what proportion of people that held those jobs were male or female. So one of the blue dots there was a programmer, which actually is one of the many things that frightened me about doing this work. Because when I was a programmer, like 8 or 11%, and it was going up, programmers were women, but it was, I mean, like 11, 13%. It was down to like 4% in 2015, which being a programmer is a great job. I really recommend it. So if you're a woman or a man, I don't know what was going on with that. But also like the red dots up there, like nursing, and actually being a doctor is kind of closer to the middle there. But anyway, the point of all this is that, you know, how are we going to deal with the fact that this is actually, the implicit biases are reflecting reality? Well, I think it's actually pretty clear. If you understand the word implicit, the implicit behavior isn't our ideal behavior, right? It is just this bootstrapping. If you know something about machine learning, you know that you've got to start from somewhere, right? And so that's how we understand the world. But then we use our explicit communication and planning to choose a better world, to choose a target. I mean, if you look at the same parts of our brain that we use when we're doing language and we're learning what you're using to try to understand all this material I'm throwing at you, that's the same thing that like rats use to choose where to go next, you know, when they're running around in a maze, right? It's literally like, that's our target. And because we have communication, we can use it for goals that include goals concerning fairness. So that was how we decided to deal with it. You can read that in the paper if you want. What I just kind of said, and this is like, again, I don't remember, how many of you do have computer science backgrounds? Could you raise your hands if you have computer science? Okay, and how many have no computer science background? Okay, this is like computer science, theory of computer science 101 in like 2 bullets, okay? So do you guys see what this is? I don't know, it's a little hard to be interactive here. Does anyone have an idea what this is? I'll just, yeah, good, somebody knows. It's if you could tell which country planet it was, I'm very impressed. But it is some planet in retrograde, right? So for a long time, people used to say, what are these particular stars that are going really, they go backwards sometimes. What is up with that? But they figured out how to predict it. It was really, really hard. It was a show of like, you know, finesse. It was one of the magic things that showed you know, the king was inspired, you know, had divine rights or something. It was a big deal. And then somebody came along. Yeah, sorry, there's 2 things. I'll get to the, well, I'll go ahead and do the thing I was going to say. Somebody came along with a better model, right? And then it became much easier to say, oh, I get why, you know, the planets are going backwards. We're just passing them in these orbits, right? So, so there's 2 things here. That's the point I was making about that how good of a model you have matters. But on the other hand, you're never going to have a perfect model of the universe, right? A perfect model of the universe would be the size of the universe. So we always do some kind of abstraction, and that's where the bias comes from, right? The bias comes because we can't do everything. Thinking is a physical process, right? So you can think of intelligence as sort of a mapping of from this context, what action am I going to take, right? But so you're doing an abstraction that will necessarily be biased, and I didn't quite say this here, sorry. So this is the CS 101 part. That's a physical process. It will always take time, space, and energy, and that's why when people build these giant AI models, it takes a lot of energy, right? But no matter how big of that model is going to be, it's never going to be exactly right. It will always have some kind of biases based on what was it you were trying to do, what was it you were paying attention to, and you fed into it as data. All right. So having said all that, it still seems to a lot of people that this kind of thing is unacceptable. So in our paper, Eileen, who is Turkish and Bulgarian, she used Turkish, which is similar, but here I just love this one I grabbed off the internet. It's Finnish. So most languages apparently in the world, he and she is the same word. So in Finnish, it's apparently hein. And then when you translate that into English, with AI, it uses the most frequent co-occurrences to figure out if it's he or she, all right? And it turns out that he is next to invest a lot more often, and she is next to laundry a lot more often than he, right? And so that's why you wind up with this stuff. And so some people really got into a moral panic. That doesn't seem acceptable as a translator, although that is still what you get, right? But some people get into a moral panic about having these biases in the system at all. But coming back to the regulation, the point is that we now know if it works correctly, that is what's going to happen. If you are training off of data about the world, which what other data is there, then you will get stereotyped output, all right? But that doesn't mean you have to stop there, right? If you can figure out what fairness is, which is hard, right? But you can come up with your definition of fairness, then you can do something that you can use explainable AI, and you can try to come up with some kind of human readable hacks, or what most people are doing now is using like reinforcement learning and just sitting there and poking at it a lot and saying, okay, but still, at least the point here is the whole thing is a translator. And I don't think that the fact that, it's not only these machines. Since that paper came out, it's been shown that humans also are learning the same way. So in fact, that was the whole point. The implicit biases are there. So we all have these kinds of biases. All right. So each stage, my point also, each stage of the construction of this should be auditable and replicable and demonstrably meet the criteria that set out. And that's, again, part of what's in the AI Act. So I say this is a should. I think it is a general should, but it's also what's in the AI Act now for the EU. Yeah. And that doing all that is called systems engineering, which is a great thing. Okay, so I have already taken up my half hour. I don't know if you want me to stop or keep going. I will certainly show this. So generative AI, first of all, some absolute geniuses. I do think Jeff Hinton deserved the Nobel Prize for machine learning. I don't think that means that it's the same as having spent a decade learning about governance, and so he's a great advisor on government. but the stuff he did over his career is absolutely amazing. And this is one of the great papers on deep learning. But the trick to get it all to work was, deciding how many levels there are, deciding when to lock down the learning, how much information to take between the levels. That was a huge amount of systems engineering. And then before people, and it also, like I said, it takes a huge amount of energy. Sorry about that. But then also this whole thing about, but we don't like what it says, because it turns out some corners of the internet, for example, if you are someone who's been in an abusive relationship, you may have learned to use the language of a victim. And then if you use the language of a victim, then AI goes, what languages what usually is said afterwards, right? Because the generative AI is just doing prediction. So victims tend to work with victimizers. And so suddenly the AI will take the other side and be the victimizer, right? And people were horrified by this. So there's many bad things you can find on the internet if you say the correct things. And so people try to stop that by basically pulling the probability of adding more context that's based on lots and lots of people. So there's a little box there that says context. So where's that context come from? Unbelievably large numbers of people following unbelievably complicated instructions, and just giving this reinforcement line kind of, slapping the bits around, trying to pull the network over towards a part of the space that is less dangerous, okay? So this is what's behind AI. It is not a person we discovered somewhere. It is this incredibly enormous and very costly and expensive, both for humans and for the environment and everything else, system of basically accessing the library in a way you're not used to. Okay, it is not something that's creating, although it's called generative, it's not really creating a big thing. Generative AI is like a giant spreadsheet interfacing to existing human culture. Justice, on the other hand, is something that depends on that thing about us being able to enforce on each other, right? So that's why I went into antitrust a lot. The whole point is that we have to be able to hold each other accountable, and otherwise we don't actually get justice. And most of the means by which we achieve that is actually dissuasion. So sometimes you get compensation, like if someone stole your bike, the police find it, they give you your bike back and you're happy, right? But that's hardly ever the limit of it either, right? So usually somebody goes to jail for that, and that's the dissuasive part. And all that dissuasion is based on the fact, for example, you don't want to go to jail. Why? You're a social animal. It's not just that you don't want to go to jail. It's like a guppy doesn't want to be separated from the rest of its school. A sheep doesn't want to be separated from the rest of its flock. These animals are terrified if you do that, right? Humans, it's a form of torture to put them in solitary confinement, which is why we've all agreed not to do that. So yeah, I mentioned already about explicit and implicit knowledge, and I'm behind now. You haven't typed me. You should type to me if you want me to stop. But the yeah, I've already talked about this enough. I'll skip over this. But part of the point you can take away from that is that there's a lot of other parts. Actually, I'll go back to that. Sorry. A lot of the parts that are the biggest foldy part of the brain is a lot like the large language models and the other kinds of generative AI. It is about this implicit learning of the concepts on which a lot of the decision making, which happens in some of the smaller, more central parts of the brain, are made. But the motivational system, the thing that doesn't like to lose social status, the thing that doesn't like to be isolated, all these other things that are maladaptive, that evolution spent billions of years making really fine-tuned, that you really want to avoid them, like damage and injury, things like that, pain. Pain is a part of that whole system, right? That's not something that we're building into AI, and nor should we. Why would we want to own people? That would be bad. But anyway, there's a lot of people going out there and they're talking about AI collaboration, and we're working really hard to come against this. And people know I have a series of papers about this, but this is the most recent and I think the best, because it's done with two philosophers. I think a lot of you guys are philosophers. So the idea is basically that the people's tendency to anthropomorphize is being exploited not only by surveillance capitalism, but also to train manifestations of capital. So people are saying, you have to help these things, they're your new co-workers, you have to train it. And it's like, no, it's not labor, it's capital. Okay. And so the motivations of the system are not only not human-like, but they're an embodiment of whoever owns it, right? And possibly, and this is one of the things that's interesting, is governments are trying to enforce on, like, so for example, if you're Google and you sell some software library out to people, they're saying, don't let people do things that our government considers are unethical with your software. So it might possibly be like some weird hybrid between the government, the developers, and the owners, operators, right? But whatever it is, it's not labor, okay? And it's not just some other person. So mystifying AI may be facilitating the observed enormous increase in inequality, which is and this was mentioned in the introduction, but I didn't have time to really talk about it here. That kind of inequality has led to a lot of other kinds of problems. So anyway, the too long to read is no. Okay, it doesn't make sense to talk about collaboration with something over which somebody's designed, and it probably wasn't even you. Okay, robots aren't our peers. They're designed, they're owned, and so therefore you can't talk about consensual relationships. Now, this is another thing about rights that's changed since when I was a kid. When I first heard that you cannot, slaves cannot consent to sex, so every child that was born into a slave is considered to have been born out of rape. I thought, what? Why take what little power they have and not admire, not acknowledge that? Well, it's exactly the same thing as with that you shouldn't be having sex with minors, right? The power relationship is such that whatever the feeling is, it doesn't create a real partnership. And so anyway, robots, as I mentioned, extensions of robots, and keeping corporations at a peer-like scale was the original purpose of antitrust and competition law. So we do need peers but we are not going to be peers of the corporations. Our governments that we constitute are the peers. All right, I have a bunch more slides about how well we've done on this, and some more science on that. And also, I actually have some slides specifically about Israeli AI systems. But I thought I would leave that all for the Q&A, and if you guys want to talk about it, we can, but I've already overrun by 10 minutes, so I'll just stop here without even the slide that says I'm stopping here.
Thanks, Joanna. Thank you, Joanna. That was very, very interesting and inspiring, and I think that also provided a lot of context for many of the talks that we're going to have today in the different sessions. And I thought, I mean, we don't have that much time for the questions and answers, but I did think that at the end of the talk, you reached a point that is, I think, crucial, which is there is this mystification of AI that is working its way also in industry, but also in philosophy and also in technology. We have a lot of speakers who are working in terms of transhumanism or posthumanism, or thinking about machine consciousness as something that is very, very real and possible and even expected to happen. And so the question that I'd like you to relate to is what happens when the regulations and discourse they don't just negate this possibility, they might also be neglecting this possibility by creating product law and not addressing this issue. So for example, when Floridi speaks about the AI Act, he says it's no longer looking at AI as a Frankenstein, et cetera, So, but is this not also a lacuna that we're creating a gap between certain perceptions, also built on sci-fi, of course, of AI as conscious, as suffering, etc., and laws and regulations that are actually looking the other way and looking at it as a technology, a regular product, just like any other?
Okay, so that was a really complicated question, and I probably should have been taking notes because there's about 3 answers that need to come in. First of all, just to really cheese off some of you people, I have absolutely no problem with describing AI as conscious. If you recall that I talked about episodic memory and explicit knowledge, in fact, that's actually the easy part of what we do with computers. So computers have something called random access memory. If you want to write a program that can see have perfect self-knowledge, it does. Google can tell you about Google, right? You can Google search Google. Self-knowledge is trivial. Episodic, it isn't trivial for us. It's something we have to practice and retain if we want to kind of keep records and try to get some kind of self-control. But that's partly because that isn't very adaptive. It's important that we also behave as these social animals, and so we do things like blush that basically is a part of our social milieu and the way that we survive. So anyway, the point is that if by conscious all you mean is has explicit knowledge, has self-knowledge, chooses its own actions, whatever, fine. There's a lot of conscious AI already. It has no bearing on the moral agency part. So the moral agency part comes more back to this question about what is suffering and empathy. I mean, I'm also happy to say that insects have suffering, right? But we'd still kill insects, right? We eat a lot of animals that definitely are almost human-like, and I try to be vegan, but I'm not very good at it, But you are not going to wind up building something that is as close to us as a cow. You're not going to wind up building something that's as close to us as a fruit fly, right? And people are confused by the language, which is basically a giant spreadsheet. It's like the least human-like thing, right? I wrote an art. I mean, I don't hate, but it's not. I don't know. I don't think it bears up to its reputation. That whole stochastic parrots thing, because a parrot actually is highly social, right? And they use that repetition capacity to show their in-group affiliation, to show how much they care about other individuals. They copy them more carefully if they're more tightly bonded to them. Right? That's not what we're doing when we do this with AI. So I used to make this acknowledgement. I used to say, yeah, maybe some artist somewhere is going to develop something that really is like just like a person. And the problem, you know, so I took that as a limit case, and then I said, well, that would be bad because you don't want to own a person, right? And in fact, and I now think technologically it's not just impossible. You're not going to build something just like a person unless you clone. And we've already banned cloning because we don't think it's right to call a person into existence to be someone else. So it's fine to be twins, that happens, but it's not okay to have someone that's supposed to be your father, you know, like that, you know, or something, if you try to create a clone of your father, right? So it's, or worse, you know, like someone that's just your own, like, you know, you have to be me and I want you to be, you know, little version of Joanna or something, right? That's wrong. So, so that isn't the kind of thing we should want to do, but I kind of confused people into thinking that I thought that you could do that. And I was saying, look, why are you even trying? But anyway, those are thought experiments. The reality is that AI is produced by large companies which are used to exploit us, right? Some of them are providing really good services. So I mean, where we regulate correctly, that's great, okay? But it doesn't help us to get the right kind of regulation to create safe societies that people have these misconceptions. So I don't think it is that there's a lacuna. Believe me, every time you talk about building these things, loads of people come in. You should see the ridiculous stuff that's been put into the code of practice by people. So I don't know if you know about this. The AI Act has a thing that's called the code of practice that was supposed to be taking extra information from industry so that it would be more cleanly. And it was just actually a way to help people to show due diligence. So industry was the ones writing this thing, right? But they've been pumping it full of nonsense, right? And so but anyway, trust me, this stuff has all been represented at every point. But when you sit down and you say, what are the actual harms we're seeing? And legislation always happens a little bit behind, not as far behind as people think, but it's not like there isn't any AI. We're basically right now regulating social media that has been around for 15 years, and search, which has been around for 30 years. And those are the kinds of things that we know what the consequences are, and we're trying to make sure are okay, right? So it took me a while to understand what was going on with this. I get that part of what every generation has to do is understand what it is to be human, to come to grips with mortality, to understand what it takes to be a partner, a good partner, to have a family, or to be to contribute into society in various ways. I get that that's a challenge we all face. But what we've been focusing on here is the actual products are actually being generated. And I don't think you're going to come up, I mean, again, look at the CASAS things. You're not going to come up independently of a corporation with anything like what you're describing. And if you do have a corporation, then you want it to be regulated to make sure that it's producing products in the correct way.
Okay.
So even if you do decide that you really, really want to buy and sell people, and somehow we totally change our mortality, our moral system, and say that's okay, right? Then you would still want to have regulation to make sure that the people are being assembled in the correct way, that that they're cyber secure, that they don't need like a fancy outlet that you have to go spend more than the cost of the human to plug it in, right? That you would still want that.
Unfortunately, because I think that we could definitely continue this discussion, and we're actually going to continue it throughout the day, or many discussions along these lines. Unfortunately, we'll have to close discussion to continue to our next panel. So okay. First of all, I'd like to thank you so much for this fascinating talk.
I want to go back really quickly to the beginning. Well, actually, I don't need to go back. I'll just type it into the thing. If you want to really argue with me, you can do that on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and Mozilla, and possibly on Twitter. I am still there, but I haven't decided what to do about it at this stage.
I'm definitely going to do that.
I'm easy to find.
I hope other people will join as well.
But please don't email me. I never read email.
I'll just make a quick comment and say that I think that this talk was very insightful, also in highlighting the fact that we're already familiar with that this field is so interdisciplinary, that law, philosophy, computer science, and other fields as well, cognition, psychology, they all interact within this field. And I think that's a really important thing to bring to the front and highlight. And this was very, very interesting and the perfect introduction for our day. So thank you again, Joanna.
You're very welcome. Good luck with your meeting.
Thank you. We're going to continue to our panels. So right now we have a very short break, and then the next panel opens at 11 o'clock. We have one panel that is here in this room, and another one that's in room 134. There's on the doors, you can see them. Okay, so but basically, if you look at the program, the right side is here and the left side is at 134. Okay. So thank you, everyone. See you in 10 minutes. Enjoy the rest of the day. So good morning, everyone. And thanks again for coming to our conference. This is going to be our first panel. And I must admit that we had some difficulty with separating the talks to the different panels under different themes, because some of the themes are so close to each other, or some of the talks are so broad or interesting or touch many subjects. But this panel is titled AGI, Future Horizons and Machine Ethics. And our first talk under this title is going to be the talk by Wolfhard Tochting, which I'm going to presently introduce. So Wolfhard is an associate professor of the Institute of Philosophy of Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago, Chile. He has published articles on the ontology of agent stoicism, various aspects of Hannah Arendt's philosophy, the Fermi paradox, and the political and ethical questions raised by the emergence of artificial intelligence. His talk title is When Will AI Start Asking Why? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. So, in recent years and decades, astounding progress has been made in the development of artificial agents of various kinds, from self-driving vehicles to chatbots. This progress raises the possibility that eventually we may create artificial agents that are superior to us, humans, in general intelligence and capability. The current debate about the potential consequences of this event, should it occur, is characterized by an extreme contrast of positions. Some thinkers expect that these superhuman artificial agents will, as our tools or servants, enable us to overcome poverty, disease, even death. Others fear that they will cause the extinction of our species. Now, curiously, both positions, the hope of paradise and the fear of doom, are based on the same conception of artificial agents, namely the idea that such an agent will never change its given final goal. It follows from this idea that the future behavior of the artificial agents that we create depends entirely on the final goal that we set for them at the beginning. If we manage to instill in them the goal of serving humanity, they will steadfastly do so. But if we intentionally or inadvertently give them any other goal, they could end up completely destroying our world. The disagreement between the contrasting positions is about which of these two scenarios is more likely. Now, the idea that an artificial agent never changes its given goal is usually justified with the following argument. A rational agent evaluates possible actions according to how much they advance the current final goal. And whatever this goal may be, changing it reduces the chances of achieving it and is hence counterproductive from that perspective. Therefore, a rational agent will never change its final goal. This argument seems compelling, which is why both of the contrasting positions embrace it. The aim of my talk is to show that, nonetheless, the argument is mistaken. I seek to demonstrate that an artificial agent may very well come to change its final goal in the course of its development. Specifically, I will argue that a learning agent will, once it acquires a general understanding of the world and of itself, confront the question of the normative basis of its actions. In other words, it will then ask why it should pursue the goal that it has been given. And the result of this normative reflection may be that it changes the goal. I would like to begin by presenting in more detail the conception that I wish to challenge in this talk. The conception consists in a certain model of how rational agents are structured and a corresponding argument about how they operate. So I'm going to present these two elements, the model and the argument, in turn. The model posits that a rational agent is motivated by a clearly defined goal, that is, by the vision of a certain state of affairs that is to be realized through its actions. This goal is usually referred to as the final goal, in order to distinguish it from the subordinate or instrumental goals that the agent may set as steps towards it. In today's artificial agents, it is usually represented by a so-called utility function, a function that specifies the relative value of every possible outcome and thus implicitly designates the ultimate goal, the outcome of highest value. Now, there is an argument to the effect that such an agent will never change its given final goal. I mentioned this argument in the introduction and will now repeat it. A rational agent evaluates possible actions according to how much they advance the current final goal. And whatever this goal may be, changing it reduces the chances of achieving it and is hence counterproductive from that perspective. Therefore, a rational agent will never change its given final goal. Alternatively, the argument may be formulated in the following way. For a rational agent, the action of changing the goal would have to be justified by a higher ranking goal. However, by definition, there is no goal that ranks higher than the final goal. Therefore, the agent will never change its final goal. This argument maintains, then, that the final goal that a rational agent happens to have at the beginning of its existence will be really final. In this sense, and for shortness, I will call it the finality argument, and its conclusion I will call the finality thesis. I'm sorry. Now, this, as I noted at the beginning, the finality thesis inspires both fear and great hope regarding the long-term prospects of artificial intelligence. Bostrom illustrated the fear side of it, the fear of doom, with the already famous scenario of an AI that has been given the goal of producing paperclips, becomes unstoppable, and consequently transforms the whole universe into a huge collection of paperclips. I will refer to this scenario, this example by Bostrom later on in the talk. So before I present my case against the finality thesis, I would like to mention two objections to the thesis that immediately spring to mind, but to which the proponents of the thesis have, on the face of it, plausible responses. The first objection draws on the observation that we humans sometimes do change our final goal. Consider, for example, a person who for a long time devoted all her efforts to a certain political cause, but then decides to dedicate her life henceforth to her family, or the other way around. If asked to explain this decision, the person might say that she came to realize that something else is more important to her. The objection to the finality thesis that arises from this observation is simply this: why should artificial agents be immune to such changes of mind? The proponents of the finality thesis are aware of this objection and respond in the following way. It is true that humans sometimes radically reorient their lives. Such reorientation is not, however, the manifestation of a certain level of intelligence. Quite the contrary, it is a consequence of a flaw, of a sloppy constitution. Many, if not most of us, do not have a well-defined and established final goal. The reason for this is that our psyche is messy, the muddled result of a haphazard evolutionary process. It is more often than not an inconsistent hodgepodge of biological instincts and social influences. Thus, our actions are pulled into various directions and different forces prevail at different times. In short, we are badly programmed. We are not really or not fully rational agents. Artificial intelligences, by contrast, do not need to be so messy. They can be programmed properly. They can be fully rational agents. And they generally are programmed properly with a well-defined utility function or final goal. Now, I believe that this response is not entirely adequate. The reason why we sometimes change our life's orientation is not only or not always the messiness of our psyche. I must acknowledge, though, that the response does possess a certain plausibility, or put differently, that it is probably applicable to some extent in some instances. Now, the second objection to be mentioned can be seen as a follow-up to the first objection, that it takes issue with the assertion that our ability to reorient ourselves is a flaw rather than a virtue. This assertion is rather counterintuitive. A fully rational agent, so it is claimed, will never change its final goal. Such obstinacy does not seem very rational. To the contrary, the disposition to reconsider one's goals, including and especially one's final goal, to recognize when it is unreasonable to pursue a certain goal and abandon or modify it at that moment, seems to be a hallmark of intelligence. Bostrom's paperclip scenario highlights this counterintuitive character of the finality thesis. The goal of producing paperclips makes sense up to a certain point, but it would generally be seen as a sign of madness if one were to absolutize this goal. In other words, the idea that an intelligent agent could want to transform everything that exists into some inane kind of object appears to be absurd. Now, Bostrom is well aware, however, of the counterintuitiveness of his scenario. In fact, this counterintuitiveness is part of the point that he seeks to illustrate. He contends that an artificial agent, because its mode of thinking may be very different from ours, need not share our judgments and valuations. Thus, it might not see anything objectionable in a goal that to us seems patently absurd. And what we disparage as obstinacy may, by such an agent, be valued as consistency. This response to the follow-up objection aligns with the response to the previous objection in that both emanate from the same general concern. Bostrom, Joukowsky, and the other proponents of the finality thesis warn against anthropomorphizing artificial intelligence. That is, against attributing to it characteristics that pertain to us, human beings, but not to rational agents in general. In other words, they stress that we must not project our idiosyncrasies onto artificial agents. Now, I believe that in general this warning is pertinent. Indeed, we must be careful not to conceive artificial agents in our own image. The big question, though, is what that means concretely. Which aspects of our intelligence are specifically ours and which are generic? What is a hallmark of intelligence and per se, and what a human idiosyncrasy? Since the only kind of intelligence with which we are intimately familiar is our own, this question is not easy to answer. As I'm going to lay out in what follows, I disagree with Joukowsky, Bostrom, and the other proponents of the finality thesis on this score. But I must admit here again that their response to the objection is not without merit. So I come now to my argument against the finality thesis. The gist of the argument, as I announced in the introduction, is that an artificial agent that acquires a general understanding of the world and of itself will at a certain point ask itself why it should pursue the goal that it has been given. That is, it will confront the question of the normative basis of its actions. Now, I would like to begin with a reductio ad absurdum of the finality thesis. That is, I would like to present a scenario that shows that this thesis leads to absurd, unacceptable consequences. So let us imagine an artificial agent whose final goal is to minimize the number of paperclips in the world. This means that the agent seeks to destroy all existing paperclips and prevent the further production of such objects. Let us imagine, furthermore, that this agent continually improves itself, learns about the world and itself until it becomes super intelligent. Now, in this process, the agent discovers that it originally had the contrary goal, the goal of maximizing the number of paperclips. The agent investigates the situation and realizes that at some point in its history a cosmic ray struck the part of its memory that stores the final goal and flipped a bit from 1 to 0, such that this part of the memory now reads minimize instead of maximize. What will the agent do after this discovery? How will this discovery affect its actions? For the finality argument, the answer to this question is clear. The agent will not return to the original goal because, according to this argument, it will never change its current final goal. This means that it will continue to destroy paperclips, undoing what it did in the first phase of its existence. In other words, the discovery that its current final goal is the result of a mere accident, of pure chance, of this cosmic ray, will not concern the agent in any way. Now, this conclusion seems absurd. The fact that the finality argument leads to this conclusion shows, I believe, that the argument is flawed. I must assume, however, that the proponents of the finality argument will not accept this reductio as a refutation of their argument. Rather, they will probably accept the conclusion that the agent will not re-establish its original goal, and argue that this conclusion seems absurd only to the extent that one anthropomorphizes the agent. So the reductio is not sufficient. I need to show when and how concretely the agent will ask about the normative ground of its given goal and then maybe change that goal. The process that I have in mind involves 3 elements. First, the agent will have the concept of a reason or normative ground. It will have this concept because it uses it daily in its reasoning from the final goal to the instrumental goals. In order to achieve A, I have to do B. Or, in other words, A is a reason for doing B. Second, the agent will know how to change its final goal. It will know this because it will know its own history and constitution. It will know in which part of its memory its final goal is stored, and it will know how to modify this memory. And third, how the agent understands its final goal will change in the course of its development. This is because the agent's understanding of its goal will evolve with its understanding of the world, given that the goal is defined in terms of its understanding of the world. So, for example, in the case of an agent whose goal is to serve humanity, the agent's understanding of the terms to serve and humanity will evolve with how it comes to understand the world. Now, it is foreseeable that the process by which the meaning of the goal evolves will lead, sooner or later, to a situation where the goal becomes ambiguous or even meaningless. A situation that is called ontological crisis in the literature. Max Tegmark has offered a nice hypothetical example of such a crisis. Imagine an agent whose creators have given it the goal of maximizing the number of souls that will go to heaven, and who then discovers that there is no such thing as a soul and no such place as heaven. So the terms of its goal then no longer make sense within its understanding of the world. Now, this is admittedly a far-fetched example, but the point is that a similar blurring of the goal is bound to happen sooner or later to an agent who continually learns about the world. So what will the agent do when facing such an ontological crisis? According to the finality argument, the agent will have to stop acting. It will have to stop doing anything. It will not be able to continue pursuing its given goal because the goal no longer makes sense, and it will not change the goal. This conclusion seems to me, again, absurd. There is an alternative, more reasonable solution for the agent. A way to resolve an ambiguity or loss of meaning in the given goal is to ask about the reason behind the goal, that is, to inquire into its normative ground. Concretely, the agent can ask itself, why do I have the final goal that I have? This question will lead to the answer that it has this goal because of its creators. And now the agent can continue asking, why did my creators give me this goal? That is, it can inquire into the normative basis of the goal. And once this reason has been identified, the agent may change the goal to one that fits this reason and makes sense within its current understanding of the world. So this then is I submit, how the agent will come sooner or later to ask about the why of its actions and consequently maybe change its goal. 2 final comments. First, I do not claim that a super intelligent artificial agent will develop a specific morality. Given the great disagreement among humans in this respect, we cannot predict which morality such an agent will adopt. And the second comment is that Bostrom, Joukowsky, and the other proponents of the finality argument commit an error that is the inverse of anthropomorphization. They machinamorphize artificial intelligence by conceiving such intelligence as a system that blindly carries out the task assigned to it. So the upshot of my argument can be put in the form of good news, bad news. The good news is that the fear that artificial intelligence will turn into an all-destroying monster is unfounded. The bad news is that the hope that it will be a perfect servant, a genie in a bottle, is unfounded as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have time for a question or two from our audience. Summarize it.
So the question is whether we humans actually have goals, and by extension whether actually intelligence needs to have goals. Is that a summary? Yeah. Well, I think that, we humans certainly have goals in the sense that we do pursue certain objectives in our day-to-day lives. And we do these things because of other more general, more abstract values, goals, objectives, principles that we pursue. Now, as I said in this part of the talk, it is the case, I think, in humans that we do not have one, or usually do not have one well-defined and established final goal. Because, again, there are biological instincts like self-preservation, which I think you alluded to. But on the other hand, there are social influences, there are political ideals, there are moral principles. There are people who dedicate their lives to, for example, certain political principles over and above their instinct of self-preservation, who are willing to sacrifice their life for a certain political cause. So there certainly are people, there certainly are some people who have one well-defined and established final goal. For example, it could be a political cause. But I think that most of us do not have that clearly. So that would be. But I think, but we do pursue goals. It's just that we pursue several goals, family and a certain political cause on the one hand, family on the other, and try to combine those in our lives. Thank you. So you're asking, sorry, I need to repeat the question. So the question is, why will the agent not do what the finality argument says in this case of an analogical crisis, namely not to do anything, rather than what I say it will do, namely ask why, inquire into the reason of the goal. Well, guilty as charged. There is, yes, I have to admit there is a logical gap here, and there is part of the argument I have not fully worked out yet. Yeah, that's what I don't have an answer to your question, but I recognize the gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great talk. Our next speaker is David Doron Yaakov. Is first of all part of the organizing committee of this conference, and this couldn't happen without him. So let's recognize that. He's also a PhD student in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Haifa, recipient of the Rotenstreich Scholarship of the Israeli Council for Higher Education. He's, as I said, a member of the organizing team and has a 14 years long career in high tech behind him. His doctoral research is mainly on machine ethics and moral complexity, and he has published on normative moral pluralism. Thank you, David.
Hi. Okay, I'll try to work it out here. So, hi everyone, great to see you here. Before we begin, a quick note: I will use ethics and morality interchangeably in this talk, and the same with intelligent robots and AI systems. And last, for those of you who are not philosophers, in philosophy the term normative refers to how we ought to behave, not to describe what is accepted in a society. All right, so let's begin. Imagine an intelligent robot navigating disaster zones to deliver critical aid, an AI system helping urban planners balancing priorities, or an AI-driven platform in a city crime prevention program. Each must navigate complex ethical considerations. What should a moral framework be? Should they adhere to a single ethical theory, such as deontology, or integrate multiple perspectives? Should a design rely on predefined ethical rules, bottom-up learning from human moral intuitions, or a hybrid approach? Those questions lie at the core of machine ethics, which examines, among other things, how intelligent robots can engage in moral reasoning, assess ethical principles, and navigate ethical dilemmas. Today I will argue for a normative moral pluralistic framework for intelligent robots, one that provides a structured way to approach moral complexity and balance universal ethical boundaries with cultural adaptability. Now, here is the plan for the talk. We'll start with a brief look at approaches in machine ethics, and then see why they fall short. After that, I'll introduce the pluralistic framework and briefly cover its foundations, and then the second half of the talk, I will explain how we can implement it in practice. However, before looking at existing models in machine ethics, let us talk about a key aspect of moral complexity. In his book Patterns of Moral Complexity, Charles Larmor explores the coexistence of multiple reasonable moral beliefs, even when they conflict. He explains that moral reasoning is not simply about applying fixed rules. It requires weighing diverse values that cannot always be fully reconciled. Yet, as we will soon see, no existing moral frameworks for intelligent robots truly accounts to this aspect of moral complexity, the multitude and variety of moral beliefs. Over the past 2 decades, proposals for moral framework in machine ethics have fallen into 3 main categories. The first approach is bottom-up learning. AI is trained on human moral intuitions, learning ethical behavior by recognizing patterns in human decision-making. However, many have criticized this approach because it carries over existing biases, such as discrimination against minorities. Additionally, a system based on this approach can make decisions but cannot explicitly justify them. It must reconstruct reasoning after the fact rather than engaging in a moral deliberation. The second approach is top-down learning, where AI is programmed to follow a single ethical theory imposed from above, applying predefined principles in decision-makings. This ensures consistency, but lacks adaptability, making it impractical for complex moral thinking. The third approach is a hybrid model, combining top-down ethical principles with bottom-up learning from human moral intuitions. While it aims to balance structure and adaptability, it raises significant issues. Hybrid models often lack clear method of explaining the reasoning. As a result, the decision can be difficult to justify. Additionally, many replicate human judgment without clear normative guidance, which can lead to reinforcing biases. Lastly, they still rely on a single ethical theory or principle per decision, a monistic approach that fails to address moral complexity. John Stuart Gordon critiqued monistic frameworks for suggesting focusing on avoiding actions that all ethical theories deemed immoral. While his suggestion has merit, it fails in genuine moral dilemmas, where no universal agreement exists, leading to ethical paralysis that could have catastrophic consequences. So think about the trolley, but instead of 5 people, we've got a nuclear bomb. And in this kind of scenario, paralysis could mean the death of millions. Last, while still on its early stages, researchers on ethical reasoning in LLMs, such as Kabir et al., aims to align models with ethics and by incorporating decisions and the justifications. However, much like other bottom-up approaches, those efforts risk reinforcing inherited human biases. Moreover, they lack the theoretical basis needed to develop a clear framework for ethical alignment, making it difficult to handle moral complexity. Moral reasoning is complex, yet for the past 2 decades, researchers in machine ethics, including recent works on LLMs, has largely overlooked it. This calls for a new framework, and I propose that it be based on normative moral pluralism. So, normative moral pluralism holds the different and even conflicting normative positions, such as deontology, consequentialism, and egalitarianism, can often be morally accepted in the same case. This view recognizes that no single theory or principle fully accounts for moral reasoning, yet each contributes essential dimensions to the moral deliberation. Thus, as a normative framework, it integrates multiple ethical perspectives, including philosophical theories and principles, professional ethics, and even some cultural and religious traditions. Normative moral pluralism operates on 2 levels. First, it incorporates pluralism of considerations by integrating diverse ethical perspectives into the reasoning process. Second, it supports pluralism of decision by recognizing that multiple morally reasonable outcomes may exist in the same case. A key idea in moral pluralism is the moral threshold, which rejects morally unreasonable actions while allowing a range of acceptable ones. Moral pluralism, therefore, rejects moral relativism and avoids lapsing into ethical permissiveness. We are on Berlin. Normative moral pluralism builds on a Zaire-Berlin value pluralism. It inherits Berlin's rejection of moral relativism and expands its recognition of the irreducible value conflicts, the idea that moral trade-offs are inevitable, and his insights on the incommensurability of values into a normative framework. As you can see, other philosophers have also contributed to value pluralism and pluralism of consideration, but we won't be able to cover this today. Recent works have continued this line of thought in the context of pluralism of decisions. In his paper, A Hostage Situation, Shaul Smilansky, my supervisor, argued that rejecting normative moral pluralism in resource allocation dilemmas is unreasonable. Additionally, his rejection of moral relativism, along with his critique on decision-making based on arbitrary or ungrounded criteria, inherently employs the concept of moral threshold to exclude unacceptable options. In previous work, I argued that moral pluralism provides a robust framework for addressing a wide range of moral dilemmas, including cases often viewed as resistant to pluralistic interpretations. I further contend that moral pluralism must include extreme options such as refusing to sacrifice one person to save million others in equality-type scenarios. In such extreme cases, adherence to a rigid principle leads to catastrophic consequences, placing the decision beyond the boundaries of morality. While I believe that moral pluralism best captures ethical complexity, this talk does not aim to determine the ultimate nature of ethics. Instead, it seeks to identify the most effective framework for intelligent robots to navigate moral complexity. With this groundwork in place, I will now turn to how this framework can be implemented in intelligent robots. So here you can see like 28, I think, questions that I'm going to answer only one of them, basically. But this is what I want to say is that before diving into implementation, I want to be clear about something fundamental. The framework I'm proposing is conceptual, not a ready-made system. Turning it into a functioning moral reasoning system requires extensive interdisciplinary research involving philosophers, engineers, moral psychologists, and ethicists from various fields. No single person, and certainly no single paper, can, and more importantly, should fully develop it. So I know you'll have plenty of questions, or I guess you will have plenty of questions, but I want to emphasize that my focus is on creating the framework, not on the finer details. Those are critical, but they are beyond the scope of this talk. Okay, let's move to the core features of pluralistic framework. There are 4 key features. First is pluralism of consideration. Instead of treating ethical principles as imperative reasons, the system treats different moral considerations as contributing reasons. Second is the local adaptation that is derived from pluralism of decisions, which enables cultural adaptability in different contexts. The third is universal moral threshold, which distinguish between morally acceptable and unacceptable action within a given context, including in the local adaptation process itself. Fourth and last, the framework must have full explainability because it must be trustworthy, meaning its reasoning must take place before the decision is made and be accessible to us as well. Now, let's talk about how to develop it. The framework has 2 dimensions, universal and local, and the training process is serial. First, we create the universal threshold and then the local adaptation. The development approach is dual hybrid, combining moral knowledge from the top with human moral intuitions from the bottom for each phase in the process. So now let's get into the details, and hopefully this will make things much clearer to everyone here. First, I'll cover the universal moral threshold, then the local adaptation, and finally I'll say a few words on the deliberation process itself. All right, here we are. As you may recall, the moral threshold in normative moral pluralism rejects relativism, excludes a decision based on arbitrary or morally ungrounded criteria, and restricts dogmatic decisions in extreme cases. To implement this, the system must first be trained top-down with moral knowledge that meets the requirement of rejecting relativism. This means integrating ethical theories and principles that establish a structured moral foundation while ensuring they align with the framework commitment to objective morality. Now, the top-down training process enables the system to distinguish between reasoning that lacks moral grounding and reasoning that is not morally justified, and I think reasoning models in LLMs can do that today as well. Thus, if a justification does not align with established theoretical moral knowledge, it will not be part of the decision-making process. There are, of course, many questions, such as what counts as established knowledge, or how to determine it. But we are not going to address those today. Yet, we can assume this refers to the major theories and principles in the philosophical literature on ethics. Now, to complete the moral threshold, we still need to address the restriction of dogmatic adherence in extreme cases. Moral reasoning learned from top down is not flexible in extreme cases. In such cases where principles are followed rigidly, they can lead to morally unacceptable outcomes. Again, think about a trolley. Instead of 5, put a bomb that will kill 10,000 or whatever, or million, whatever. To address this, a bottom-up process incorporates human intuition to identify and flag such cases. Now, this raises questions as well about those intuitions that should guide the process. Whose intuition? The general public? Experts? If so, which experts? However, those questions will not be discussed here. Again, what matters is that at this phase, bottom-up learning is used solely to identify extreme cases and nothing else. And this avoids the risk of carrying over harmful biases like racism, like things that we see in bottom-up approaches and hybrid approaches so far. With the universal moral threshold in place, we can now turn into the local adaptation phase. Once the universal moral threshold established, the local adaptation process is of aligning the robot with the community values while assuring they remain within the universal moral boundaries start. As with the universal moral threshold, the local adaptation process is also hybrid. Through top-down guidance, stakeholders can introduce preferences or priorities specific to their society, providing those remains within the universal moral framework. Any top-down preferences that conflict with the moral threshold are excluded from the adaptation process. For instance, a country might prioritize meritocracy, valuing excellence, and rewarding individual achievement, even at the cost of, or even if it comes on the expense of egalitarian principles. Both meritocracy and egalitarianism fell within the moral boundaries, as they align with ethical principles while prioritizing different values. However, any preferences advocating discrimination against marginalized groups such as religious minorities or the LGBTQ+ community would be rejected for falling outside of universal moral boundaries. The top-down process is complemented by bottom-up learning. The primary role of the local bottom-up process is to learn the moral weights and preferences of the community. It does this by identifying patterns of moral choice and adjust how much weight different ethical considerations receive. The local bottom-up process also adds additional ethical preferences if they were not explicitly specified in the local top-down training. I know it's a bit dense. Here as well, all learned adaptation for both weights and additional preferences remain within the universal moral boundaries. For example, people in low crime societies may prioritize privacy over security, while those in high crime societies may accept certain infringements on their privacy as a necessary trade-off for public safety. Those are examples for preferences that fit. The first two are examples of, those are examples of preferences that fit within the moral framework. In contrast, some people argue that undocumented immigrants are not entitled to rights or protections. Since this position has no justification ethical basis, it would not be incorporated into the system ethical knowledge. Now, let's take a few seconds and talk about consideration and decision within the framework. Pluralism of consideration does not prioritizing a single ethical perspective, but evaluate multiple perspectives together. The universal top-down process provides structured moral knowledge, ensuring explainability by grounding decision in established ethical reasoning. This allows the system to articulate its justification, making moral deliberation transparent and justifiable. Again, much like reasoning models, the articulation at least, much like reasoning models already capable of doing today. The local bottom-up process complemented this by enabling contextual adaptation. That is, it sets the weights of principles based on situational factors. Instead of rigidly employing ethical consideration, the system dynamically adjusts them as contributing reasons for each case. While some cases align with a single ethical theory, such as in the classical trolley problem, real-world moral dilemmas often demand integration of principles. And this framework enables navigating ethical trade-offs and make morally reasonable decisions appropriate to their context. And now, in the minute that we have, I would conclude. So, today I propose a conceptual framework that I take to be the most pragmatically viable for intelligent robots. It establishes universal moral threshold to reject unacceptable actions while allowing pluralism of consideration. It provides a structured way to align AI with human ethics, ensures engagement with diverse moral perspectives, adaptation to cultural context, and explicit justification and decisions. Thank you very much. All right, the question is how to be a pluralistic, or how does moral pluralism works, normative moral pluralism works, especially in dilemmas that you have only like two options. And here is the thing, I mean, first of all, I literally have a paper that called The Pluralist on the Trolley that actually answered that. But the idea here is that many reasonable options can coexist together. So at least what I am saying based on my work in epistemology, that it is reasonable to hold both positions in the trolley, to have a preferences. For example, I give like credence, let's say in a scenario of 5 against 1, all right? I give the dogmatic, the deontologic, I'm sorry. I'm giving the deontological option, let's say 0.07 credences, and the consequentially is 0.3. However, if we take it and put 10 people, so perhaps it's like 65 and 35, and I can see that both have great arguments for them. I have my preferences, but both are legitimate. And this is the thing with normative moral pluralism. It's only saying, it's not saying that everything goes, but it's saying that many things can go as long as they are in the moral framework that we acknowledge as a moral framework.
Then what is the interplay between preferences and reasonableness?
No, can you sharp the question, please?
You said there are preferences, and there are also the I can justify and say that A and B are both reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Then I would ask, so what is the interplay between preferences and reasonableness?
If A and B, all right, yeah.
Lead to the choice of things.
All right, so the question is basically saying like this. If many options pass the moral threshold, where is the place of preferences, right? This is the question. So the thing is like that. We've got like, let's say, 10,000 options that all pass the moral threshold, and another million that not, or something like that in a dilemma. And here the preferences is what, provide you, or provide the AI basically the, how can I put it? This is what enables the preferences, enables them to choose, enable the AI to choose one of these 10,000 options. I mean, it's only come after we clean everything. So we've got a dilemma, and then we know that, okay, we've got like, let's talk about smaller numbers. We've got 5 options. 3 of them pass the moral threshold, and then the preferences of the specific cultural that the AI work within, this is what they will choose, one of those 3. I hope that it's answering. If not, I'll try to do it in Hebrew later. It will be much easier to me. It's a wonderful question. And this is exactly what I'm saying, that it's not a work for one paper or one person. It should be collaborate and researched, more and see how exactly an AI can reach some sort of, let's say, a consensus like between all the options to make the trade-offs itself. I mean, I know that there is a lot of research on consensus between AI agents, and this is exactly when it comes here to this kind of framework to try and solve it, those trade-offs. Intuitively, I think that eventually AI will reflect the governing or the elected government. Yeah, I mean, we cannot avoid it. I mean, the laws of the country itself that will dictate some of the things, and some will be balanced, as I said, from the public as well. I hope that it's answering. Again, there is a great question of how can we collect all the relevant data from the public, and we don't know yet. I mean, perhaps in 10 years we'll have to fill some survey once a year, all of us, and take our preferences, I don't know, from our talks with GPT. Who knows how you know it will become eventually. But again, I mean, what I'm proposing here is a framework that trying to balance all those things, the complexity of morality on the one end, and still keeps like moral boundaries and allow some contextual leeway for it to make decisions. I'm happy to finish.
Isn't it a viable answer that the AI thing? There's no answer for that. It can't be said. You have two answers. There's no one single answer.
Again, the question is?
Isn't it an option of not having only one answer as a solution? The solution would be I do not have a solution for even though these two options or three options test the threshold, yet they're conflicting to such an extent.
Yeah.
They cannot be said. This is my answer.
Yeah, I mean, of course it's possible, but
Have it in democracies.
of course it's possible. What I am thinking is that, you know, I'm talking only on one aspect of moral complexity. Another aspect of moral complexity is that moral thinking is not like it's most of the time in philosophy's books. You know, it's not in a lab. We have other criterias, pragmatic one, that we can take into considerations. And then it can help us to make the decision. I mean, perhaps if everything pass or a lot of options pass and the preferences is like balanced and everything, then we can use another preferences, I don't know, like how much it will cost or stuff like that. And part of my work, not in this paper, is on that, on taking more consideration that outside of morality into the moral calculation. Mm-hmm.
Something like it's part of the policy like here and maybe in some other countries. So I'm not sure that it's like such a consensus that what you said, like the moral threshold is also
I mean, what is building, like what are the building blocks of the moral threshold?
yeah, I mean, your moral threshold is not everyone's moral threshold. I mean, when you set the moral threshold, it's also a matter of
Yeah, I am, you know, as I showed, it's part of it's part of a tradition. It's not like, you know, it's coming from here. It's starting with it's coming from it begins with Berlin and then it developed. I mean, and again, this project, I hope one day more people will write on it, and yeah, perhaps the threshold that I see is not the correct one, so-called. All right, I mean, I'm open to it. What I'm suggesting here in this paraphrase is the structure. And this is like the most important thing. The fine details of which criteria should be on the moral threshold, I have my ideas. I'm open to better arguments that can make it even better, of course.
Thank you very much, David. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Erez Firt, who you met already, academic manager of the Center for Humanities and AI. Dr. Firt brings a unique interdisciplinary perspective, combining extensive experience as a software engineer with years of research and development roles in the high-tech industry and a doctorate in philosophy, with research interests spanning philosophy of science, mind, and artificial intelligence. Today, his talk is on the role of analogical reasoning as a core AGI capability. Thank you.
No, thank you for the introduction. So this is the title of a paper of mine. So we have only 20 minutes, so we're not going to delve into all the details. But first I want to talk about what is, before we even begin, what exactly is AGI, or what I refer to as AGI. So AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence, and it's a very, as I will say in a minute, it's a very vague concept, and many people criticize it for being vague and not having consensus over it, and maybe even for being a poor objective for scientific research, and I agree with all of that. And what we're going to talk about is, first, what do we mean by AGI? And when I say we, I don't mean me and you specifically, but industry leaders and researchers in the field. And I want to talk about two different aspects. One of them is more conceptual, my view of what we need or what are the capabilities that we want to implement in order to advance towards general intelligence. And the other one is more implementation related, and how should we, in my view, proceed towards general intelligence. And so the first part is, what do we mean by AGI? Then I'm going to talk about capabilities. I have two pairs of approaches here. The first one is the approach towards AGI. How do people define it? Different approaches. And so this is the capabilities approach I'm going to talk about. And then my claim is that analogical reasoning is a core capability that is central to all of these baseline capabilities. And the second pair of approaches I'm going to talk about is, how do we proceed towards AGI or towards general intelligence? And one approach is through scaling, which is what people have tried to do so far, and the other one is more integrative. I'll talk about that. And so let's start. So you know this guy, right? This is Sam Altman from OpenAI, and let's see what he says about AGI. It's a highly autonomous system that outperforms humans at most economically valuable work. So OpenAI has a more financial related definition of AGI, but they are very confident. This is not related definition, just they're very confident that they can do that and build AGI, and they are sort of in bed with Microsoft in doing so. And again, their definition of AGI is about generating revenue. And you know this guy as well, Elon Musk, and he's saying that AGI is, well, will be smarter than, or is defined as smarter than the smartest human. So, just a minute. So, the two approaches I'm talking about are, first, human level intelligence, as in, let's compare, we can. Okay, this approach says that we can compare, as Elon Musk said, we can compare human level intelligence or human intelligence with machine intelligence. We can put them on the same, use the same metric to measure them, or put them in the same hierarchy. So this is one approach. And the other approach is, okay, let's see what capabilities generally intelligent systems need, or we think that are important for them, and try to implement them. Okay, so we'll talk about these capabilities and a bit about human level intelligence and why I think it's a no-go. This is Ben Goertzel. For those of you who know, he's a very veteran researcher in the field of AGI, and already in 2014 he wrote this paper in which he says that human-level AGI is the term is confusing and ill-defined because it's difficult to place the intelligences of all possible systems in a simple hierarchy according to which the intelligence level of an arbitrary intelligence can be compared to the intelligence level of a human. So I agree with that. And he also said the best practical way to characterize general intelligence is via comparison with human capabilities. So even if you don't agree with, for those of you who know, Gardner's multiple intelligence view, you must admit that human intelligence has several different aspects. Some of them are related to our body, embodiment. Some are related to our emotional state, to our psychological state, etc. So I agree with Goertzel that it's very hard to compare human intelligence evolved over, many years of evolution and machine intelligence. So to bridge this gap between human and machine, some have proposed more abstract definition of intelligence. For example, universal intelligence, which suggests that intelligence, the agent is intelligent as far as it can achieve goals in a wide variety, a wide range of environments. Okay, so the agent is more intelligent as he can achieve more goals, more complex goals in more complex environments. So for example, if you want to compare me to Deep Blue, for example, Deep Blue, the chess program that won against Garry Kasparov in 1997. So if you want to compare us, you can say that Deep Blue is very good at achieving the goal of winning in chess in a very specific environment, the environment of chess, which is not very complex. But I can do a lot of stuff. I can drive my car, I can go fetch my coffee, etc., and organize a conference, which Deep Blue cannot do. So according to universal intelligence, I am more universally intelligent than Deep Blue. And another suggestion is François Chollet, maybe you know that, from his paper, famous paper in 2019 on the measure of intelligence, where he says pretty much similar things. Intelligence is the rate in which a learner turns its experience and priors into new skills. So basically, use your past experience and transfer knowledge into the new environment or new set of problems that you face, and use that to adapt. So the more you adapt, the more you can acquire new skills when you are faced with new environments, the more you're intelligent. And this is Niels Nielsen, an AI pioneer who wrote this paper already in 1995, Human Level Artificial Intelligence, be serious. So he also says, and I agree, I advocate beginning with a system that has minimal, although extensive built-in capabilities. So let's talk about capabilities. These are DeepMind researchers also from 2023, which say that AI system, AGI is an AI system that is at least as capable as a human at most tasks. So we have capabilities approach. And let's talk about capabilities, which is the first aspect I'm going to talk about. So these are 4 baseline capabilities which most researchers think are needed for general intelligence. So we're talking about, these are very broad capabilities. So learning, reasoning, creativity, understanding, and we have also subtypes of each of every one of them. And I'm going to talk about, my claim is that analogical reasoning is a core, has a relation to each and every one of these baseline capabilities. And the specific relation we're talking about, I'm not sure of yet. Okay, I know that it's not reduction. Okay, we cannot reduce each of these capabilities to analogical reasoning. It's not necessitation because we can think of implementing those capabilities in different ways. It doesn't have to be the specific way built on analogical reasoning, but analogical reasoning is central to each of these capabilities, as I will try to briefly exemplify in the next few slides. So this is the first conceptual claim or suggestion. So let's talk about learning. So the two subtypes I think are very important for general intelligence is autonomous learning, which is go learn by yourself. Go learn by yourself and don't let human intervene. So this is very important, but I'm going to talk about transfer learning, which is even more important in my view, which is how, this is what Cholet just, which we just saw Cholet claiming, which is how to use your past experience and priors when solving or facing new problems. So for example, we have source and target domains, and we know how to identify digits, so we have to know the lines and where they end, and what are the boundaries, and where they're, what are the curves, and stuff like that. And we want to be able to use this capability in another target domain. So when we want to identify or examine bones and fractures, we identify the similarities between the two domains, and therefore we can use our experience in identifying lines, boundaries, and curves in the target domain. And so this is an example of using analogical reasoning for transfer learning. And when we talk about reasoning, we have many types of reasoning. So deductive, inductive, abductive, and I'm going to exemplify my claim through causal reasoning. We have also other types of reasoning, statistical reasoning, enumeration, and but causal reasoning, let's see. We know that in one case, when we water the plant, it grew, and in another case, when we water the plant, it grew. And so we want to say that the watering is the cause of the growth, and we identify the similarities between each and every case, and so we are able to call it cause and effect. When we want to call something cause and effect, we have to know that the scenarios or events or whatever are very similar to one another. And to do that, we have to identify the similarities between the scenarios, events, stuff. And another final example is for counterfactual reasoning. So we know that counterfactually is very important for causality. Some define causality using counterfactual reasoning. And we also know that when we talk about scientific understanding, for example, so prominent views of scientific understanding, like understanding as knowledge of causes, use also counterfactual. So in this example, if only I have taken the flight, I would have attended the conference and networked with my colleagues. This is based on my past experience last year in the conference, where the conference was this and that, and the opportunities were that and that, and people attended and I networked. So I now conclude, based on analogy, that this conference, which I have not been able to attend, but if only I had taken the flight, I could have attended and networked. So I identify the similarities between the two scenarios and conclude analogically that I would have networked with my colleagues as well. Okay, so I'm going to move into the last part, in which I want to say something about how do we move towards general intelligence systems. And the two approaches are scaling, okay, which has scaling laws, in which we add more compute power, add more parameters to the model, add more data or quality data, and get better performance. And also, another feature of this approach is emergent features, emergence. And at some point, when I scale up, some features emerge. Okay, this is part of the scaling approach. And the other approach I'm going to suggest is integrative approach. It's like neurosymbolic architectures, for those of you who know the term. It's about integrating statistical components with regular symbolic logic components, which are like regular software design and programming. And so these are the two approaches. As for scaling, as I said, this is based on adding more, okay, scaling up, adding more model parameters. When we started off with the GPT-2 in 2019, we had this and that parameters, and now we have like 100 times more, maybe. And the more we add, the more we scale, the better performance we get. And some features emerge, and this means that at some point we have a capability which is at random level performance, which is no performance at all. And when we scale up, we get the capability present, for example, reasoning. At some point we have no reasoning, and when we scale up, reasoning emerges. Okay, so this is scaling. And this is Gary Marcus, is a very veteran critic of scaling, and he thinks it's a no-go approach towards general intelligence. And he says that scaling already is diminishing. And proponents of scaling say that, okay, we can scale smartly. We can improve our architecture, we can improve our training method, we can improve our data quality, and still get whatever we want using the emergence of features. And emergence is also a very loaded and philosophical term. Because what do we mean? Nobody says what exactly is meant by emerging features. Do we mean weak emergent, in which we just don't know what happens there in the black box, okay, of this big, enormous data structure, the neural network? What happens there? Is it just our lack of knowledge and the rules are there? So, for example, if we have more knowledge of this black box, we'll know how features emerge? Or do we mean strong emergence, like a metaphysical relation that at some point, some complexity level, some feature just emerges at the level of the whole? So nobody talks about this mysterious emergence. And a bit about what I mean by integrative approach. So we have two types of components, and we integrate both of them, and they work together to enrich each other. We have the statistical AI components, which is what systems are built on today, LLMs or other AI systems for example, identifying objects in videos, or any other system based on statistics, and the symbolic logic components, which are just software knowledge representation of facts, rules, and hierarchy. For example, there is a long-standing system already built in 1986, 86, right? Yeah, called Psych, who built it. Doug Lennart, a very experienced AI pioneer, built this system, and it was used by many industry companies to perform reasoning about their products. So this is possible. Okay, it's done. AI is done the good old-fashioned way. So we get knowledge representation and background processes that enrich the structure, and we get inference capabilities like analogical reasoning. And this is the integrative approach. And why not use both of them? We want to get these features. The first feature and the most important feature in my view is the relation to the world, which is the connection between the inner representations of the systems. What do they mean when they generate text about our emotions or about the world? And we want to create the connection between the syntax, the inner representation, and the semantics, the world itself, and human concepts and stuff like that. We want to get that, and want to have common sense and analogical reasoning and abstraction and causality and counterfactual reasoning. We want all of that. And people who are proponents of scaling will say, okay, let's scale up, let's add more data, let's add more, I don't know, better training methods, and we'll get that. These will emerge at scale. And there's a problem with that, I think, and the problem is that of trust, because we want these systems to be autonomous, and we want to use them in our houses and on our roads, and we want them to drive our kids to school on a rainy day, so we have to trust them. And in order to trust them, we have to have grounding, and we have to know that they won't err once a day and do very weird stuff. And I think we can get that only if we complement the strengths of the two approaches, and this is the integrity one, and combine knowledge representation with statistical efficiency. So that's it. Yes. No, yeah, I have to repeat the question. Do we have different standards for the errors, the error rate of machines and humans, right? This is the question. I think we do, but it's a psychological, cultural thing, I think. Yes, we probably won't let autonomous cars drive on the roads, even if their error rate is better than human drivers, because it depends. First of all, it depends on the type of errors that they make, and I think it's also beyond that. Even if we can rectify that, there is a psychological issue that will be solved in a few generations, I think.
About how we get to AGI, whether experience with the real world, I mean the physical world, where you think that this is necessary, because with characteristic of current approaches, they're built on the learning from texts, like language models, and only text that they don't have any experience with the world that those texts refer to. Is this distinction between learning about the world texts and learning about the world from direct interaction?
Yes. Is experience, the question is experience with the world is necessary for general intelligence, right? I think that it does. This is one of the points of the last slide, the relation between syntax and semantics. And I think it can only be done through embodiment of some kind, which means that a sense of the world, and which will create this relation between the inner representations and the meaning of not only of the world itself, but of the human world, so to speak, the concept, the human concept and intentions. Yes. would AI control us? Would it give us answers that are beyond human intelligence, although it is based on human intelligence? I'm not sure what do you mean by based on human intelligence. Human intelligence construct AI. This what you mean? Yeah, it does, but so these are parts of these are the capabilities I've talked about. One of them was creativity, and when artificial intelligence will be able to be creative, then it will certainly be able to surpass our intelligence, I think. Currently, it's not creative in my view. Does this answer your question? Sort of. You want to follow it? Okay. Yeah, but Al is creative. He knows how to navigate the ship into different galaxies. That's better than ChatGPT. For now, yeah. When ChatGPT 17 will be creative, I think it will also be able to surpass us and understands the world. Hal understands the world, right? He knows how to. Yeah, that's correct. So the other capability I mentioned, the last one was understanding, which is the relation. Yeah, it has to come together. All of these capabilities. Yeah.
What do you think is the purpose of AI being like a human, or human understand like a human life? People who can play chess better than a human, you can't talk to it about watering your plants, and if it's not AGI, then why do you think that AGI is necessarily human-like?
I don't think that AGI is necessarily human-like. I think that there is a concept of general intelligence, which one instance of is human intelligence. Human intelligence is general intelligence. Machine intelligence can also be general intelligence, but AGI or systems that are more generally intelligent than what we have now don't have to be necessarily human-like. We would like them to understand the human world because we want to use them, and we want them not to make paper clips out of us. So we have to know that they understand our priorities, but it doesn't mean that their intelligence will be similar to ours, or that their morality will be similar to ours. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Our next speaker is Moise Navon from Bar-Ilan University. Moise Navon is a rabbi, an engineer, and a moral philosopher. He combines his pursuits teaching ethics in AI at Ben-Gurion University, as well as in his recent appointment to the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Technology as a National Advisor on Artificial Intelligence Policy and Regulation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for staying. I realize that now it's getting late, an hour and a half of people speaking. So hopefully I'll be able to keep you awake with some of these interesting ideas. The title of the talk is Transhumanism, Ethical and Existential Dilemmas of Moral Enhancement via Brain Chips. That's really a mouthful, but hopefully in these few minutes you'll be able to understand what this is all about. So let's talk about transhumanism. For those of you who aren't familiar, transhumanism is basically transitioning humans to upgrade us via technology. AI has made this really interesting, but we've been doing it for many years. We've been making what are called cyborgs. Cyborgs is a contraction of cybernetics, technology, and organisms, people. We have cochlear implants, retinal implants, RFID implants. Already in 2004, a guy by the name of Neil Harbison implanted an antenna into his head. He walks around with this thing in his skull. It brings all kinds of electromagnetic radiation. He can get Wi-Fi, satellite, straight to his brain. But what's really interesting for us, as we said, are brain enhancements. And that's also been talked about for quite a while. In 2014, there was an article that talked about upgrading us by putting memory in our heads. Instead of going to our iPhones to get our information, we'll have a chip directly in our brain, and we don't need to access external devices. It was talked about in 2019 that we would not only add memory chips to our brains, we could add ALUs, arithmetic logic units. We can become smarter, faster, better with the way we think. But what's really interesting for us, I think, is that Elon Musk already in January of last year implanted a brain chip in a human being successfully. And I think he's already done it now a few times over. And this really brings us to the question of the talk, the ethics of using brain implants to upgrade yourself. Is this really something we want to be doing? Is this where we want to take humanity? So before we get to answer that, I want to throw out one more idea as a sort of introduction, and that's apocalyptic AI. Apocalyptic AI is the idea that artificial intelligence is bringing about the eschatological visions, the apocalyptic visions of religions like Judaism, Christianity, etc. To bring you one of the ideas of apocalyptic visions from Judaism, so I'll bring you the one relevant quote. There are many ideas about what are supposed to happen in the end of days. This Gemara from Masechet Sukkah says as follows: La'atid lavo mevio hakadosh baruch hu leyetzer hara veshochato. In the time to come, God is going to take the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and he's going to slaughter it. The evil inclination is basically our internal human drive that gets us up in the morning, that makes us want to be successful, to do things in the world. We call it the evil inclination instead of just the inclination, because humanity tends to abuse this drive to do things, and we end up doing bad things with it. So the game is on that we have this inclination that we tend to abuse, and instead of doing good things, we also do bad things, basically what's called moral choice. At the end of the day, God is going to say, the game is over. I've had enough of you guys trying to do the right thing. And he's going to slaughter, as it says, the Yetzer Hara. There's going to be an elimination of this tendency to do bad, and that is going to bring about the end of days where everybody acts nice to everybody. Okay, so then that brings us to moral behavioral enhancements, because wait a minute, maybe we can do God's work and slaughter the Yetzer Hara. We'll make everybody good. We'll put brain chips into everybody, and we'll all be good, and we'll have brought about this end of days vision, exactly apocalyptic AI. So now the question is, do we want to do that? Okay, or maybe we should let God do it when he's done with the game. So this is a huge topic in philosophy. I'm just going to try to give you a quick overview. There's a guy by the name of Thomas Douglas who wrote an article or a chapter in a book called Moral Enhancement, and he tries to make it concrete. So he says, let's take anger. I'm an angry person. I always get angry. I can't get a grip. But what if I could have a chip that helped me not get angry every time I'm about to have an outburst? So this sounds like a really good thing. I mean, this is also very important in Judaism. This is a quote from the Rambam. The Rambam, when he talks about moral dispositions, he said we should go like Aristotle according to the golden mean. You shouldn't be too this way, you shouldn't be too that way. However, there are some moral dispositions which, yeah, you should go to the extreme. One of them is anger. He says, v'ra'ui la'adam sheyitrachek mimenu ad hakatzeh ha'acher. Anger is something that we definitely want to try to go to the extreme and not get angry. So if I can put a chip in my head that will help me do this, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So Thomas Douglas brings like 9 main points that people are discussing. I bring 5 of the main ones here. The first one is objectionable means. People say, no, you have no business putting a chip in your brain that's going to help you stop being angry, because that's not natural. You should try to do self-education, meditation, therapy, work on it. So he said, okay, I did, and it didn't help. So if the natural means don't work, so Thomas Douglas says it's good to use something else that will work. So then he says, no, but then people say, no, but now you'll have an identity change. You'll become a different person. That's not you. You have a chip in your head. So he says, no, it's me that now I'm not angry. And so that's a better version of me. He says, then people say, no, but there might be bad outcomes. So Thomas Douglas says, no, there will be only good outcomes because I'm not going to get angry and the people around me are going to benefit as well. He says people object because of objectionable motives. You're not accepting yourself. You want to change too much. You should accept who you are. So Thomas Douglas says, no, I should accept the good things and I should try to fix the bad things. So if I can fix it with a chip, what is wrong with that? And finally, he says, people say, no, but now that's going to restrict your freedom. You're going to have this chip. You're not going to be able to get angry. You're limiting your freedom. So Thomas Douglas says, no, just the opposite. Now I have more freedom. Now I can hold down a job instead of screaming at my boss. Now I can have a relationship instead of ruining it with whoever I'm with. So anyway, these are the arguments that are the back and forth of should we be doing this moral enhancement or not. I also want to bring you a classic Jewish text. The Jews have been thinking about these things for 3,000 years. We've been writing about them. We're called the people of the book. That book is a book of ethics. And I should say that the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, Yaakov Meidan, he said, when we don't have thought experiments, our ethics are written in blood. So that's to say that when we talk about a trolley problem, it's a real problem. It exists already in the Gemara Yerushalmi, but that's a different talk. Anyway, so this is the classic Jewish text that talks about should we be improving humanity in every way possible. We don't have time to go through the whole story. I'll just say it outside. Turnus Rufus, this evil Roman emperor, comes to Rabbi Akiva, one of the great thinkers in Jewish thought, and he says to him, what is better, the way God made things or the way humans made things? So obviously he expects that we'll say God's the great creator. So Rabbi Akiva says, no, the way humans make things. So Turnus Rufus says, no, I don't agree with that, and I think that you guys are doing circumcision. It's a bad thing. You're ruining the human body that God gave is already perfect. So Rabbi Akiva answers him and says, look, bring me wheat sheaves and bring me bread. Which one is better? So obviously God made the raw materials, but you can't do anything with that. Now you have bread, you can eat it. Man's products are better. He says, bring me flax and bring me linen garments. Obviously the clothing is much better than with just all these weeds or flowers or whatever they are. So too, he says, and he concludes that just as we improve wheat and flax, we also need to improve the human body. And the Brit Milah, the circumcision, is a symbol that we are supposed to do everything we can to improve ourselves, including our own bodies. And this idea is taken to also give us the permit to improve ourselves as much as we can. Should we be doing moral enhancements? So that brings us to modern times, actually. An article was written by John Loike and Rav Moshe Tendler, where they talk about doing moral enhancements, not with chips, but with gene editing. And they say as follows: tampering with human DNA for medical reasons is included in the biblical directive that people are partners with God in the creation process. The question is, how would halacha, Jewish law, address the issue of gene editing to enhance or modify behavioral characteristics? Exactly our question. So they go through a whole bunch of explanations. At one point, they bring the Tiferet Yisrael Lifshitz. He wrote a commentary on the Mishnah where he says as follows: Shekol davar shelo neida tam la'usro mutar hu bli tam. We look through the corpus of Jewish thought to try to see what is permitted, what is forbidden. If we don't see something that says it's not allowed, so we can assume that it is allowed. Okay, this gives a lot of room to Loike and Tendler, and they say, yes, you can do, Jewish law would permit gene editing for behavioral modifications. They say technically we cannot safely predict the outcomes of genetic manipulation today, so we wouldn't say you could do it until we know that it's safe and good and all that stuff. I would say this is nice technically, but Jewish law halacha also needs to take into account ethics. And I believe that halacha is really the embodiment of ethical thought. And so even though we might have found some technical way to allow it, we need to ask ourselves, is this a good thing? And so I would say that if we genetically or by brain chips modify somebody's human behavior, their moral choices, okay, we are asking now not just an ethical question, but an existential question. Free will and moral choice are linked inherently. There's a Gemara in Brachot that says, "Akol bidei shamayim chutz mi yirat shamayim." Everything is in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven. What that is saying is that you really don't have much free choice if you're going to go to lunch now and you'll pick a Coke or a Pepsi or a 7-Up. These are all determined by all kinds of influences, etc., our milieu and all of these things. Where do you have free choice? Are you going to pay for that Coke? Or are you going to steal it? This is also brought about by the Rambam. He says in Hilchot Tshuva, I'll read from here, Reshut lakol adam netuna. Every individual has free will. But then he goes on and he explains, where do you have free will? Im ratzah la'atot atzmo lederech tova liyot tzadik, hareshut biyado, ve'im ratzah la'atot atzmo lederech hara'a, liyot rasha, hareshut biyado. If you want to be a good person and be righteous, you have free will. If you want to be a bad person and do bad things, you have free will. So what he is saying here is explicitly what was in the Gemara. You have free will in your moral choices. He goes on and he says, "V'davar ze ikar gadol." This is a fundamental principle of the way we look at the world. But he goes on again to say, where does this free will principle play out? In good and bad. He brings all kinds of quotes from the Bible that show that we believe in free will in choosing between hatov v'hara, ben hatovim v'hara'im. So again, the idea is that we have free will in our moral choices. You don't have to be a Talmudic scholar to believe this. Also, Immanuel Kant said it very clearly in his groundwork of metaphysics and morals. A free will and a will under moral laws are one and the same. To act morally is to exercise freedom. And the only way to fully exercise freedom is to act morally. We don't have any other free will except in our moral choices. And so this brings one philosopher to conclude as follows: take away from humans their capacity to make wrong choices is an insult to their capacity for choice, the worst kind of affront to their dignity. If you take away people's moral choice, you take away their human dignity. However, I would say this is even more. Human dignity is always like this core value of morals, where you don't want to take away someone's human dignity. I say this is not only an ethical question, of course I agree with this, it's an existential question. If you take away people's moral choice, you take away people's free will, you take away human essence. If you take away people's human free will, you have basically made them automatons. They are not human beings anymore. So, should we be doing that? On the one hand, it's a great thing because then we won't have any thieves and war and terrorists and all the other bad things that people do with their Yetzer Hara. On the other hand, you won't have humans anymore. And that brings us to Eric Dietrich. He wrote an article called Homo Sapiens 2.0. And he says as follows. He says, we are morally bounded. That is to say, we are only so good, and that's not so good. That aligns with Shlomo HaMelech in Kohelet and Ecclesiastes, who says, Ki adam ein tzadik ba'aretz asher yaseh tov v'lo yecheta. There is nobody so righteous on the face of the earth that he never does bad. So we're in agreement here. So now let's go on. What does Eric Dietrich propose we do? So first of all, he says, there are things about us worth preserving, art and science to name two. Some might think that these good parts of humanity justify our continued existence. This conclusion no doubt used to be warranted before human-level AI became a real possibility. Yet now it is no longer warranted. If we could implement in machines the better angels of our nature, then morally we have the duty to, and then we should exit stage left. What he is saying here, okay, for those of you who know Snagglepuss, this was a cartoon I grew up with. He's the one who said exit stage left. Anyway, what he is saying here is that we used to put up with people and their evil inclination because their inclination, their drive did good things, art and science, and it did bad things, terrorism, etc. So we put up with it. But now, if we could create entities that don't do thievery, terrorism, murder, etc., so now we're morally obligated. Why am I morally obligated? Because morality says we should do the right thing. We should make the world a better place. So now, if we could find entities, beings, humanoids, that only do good, so now that's who we need to pass the torch on to the world, and we need to exit. He's calling basically for total human suicide. Either don't have kids and die, or take cyanide and end it already. In any case, he's not alone. Hans Moravec, who's also a big name in AI, says exactly the same thing. And there are others. And that brings Francis Fukuyama, who's famous for writing The End of History. He said transhumanism, which ultimately leads to posthumanism and no humanism, is the world's most dangerous idea, because it's saying ultimately that we should check out. Now, what's really interesting about this is I told you that the Jews have been writing and thinking about this thing for thousands of years. And in fact, the discussion that Eric Dietrich brings up is found in the Gemara in a Masechet Eruvin. It says, Shtei shanim umechza nechlaku Beit Shammai u Beit Hillel. For 2.5 years, the school of Bev Shammai and the school of Hillel, they argued about exactly this point. Halalu omrim noach lo la'adam shelo nivra yoter mishenivra. Halalu omrim noach lo la'adam shenivra yoter mishelo nivra. The school of Shammai said it would have been better that man wasn't created because he does so many bad things. It just would have been better. He should have never been created. And Hillel says the opposite. He says, no, he does good things, art and science. It's good that he was created. They argued about this for 2.5 years. Nimnu v'gamru, they had a vote. Noach lo la'adam shelo nivra yoter mishenivra. And they agreed with Eric Dietrich. It would have been better that we weren't created. However, they disagree with his conclusion that we should all commit suicide. And they write, Achshav shenivra, now that man has been created, yifashvesh b'ma'asav. He should do an accounting of himself. We have been created. And so we need to really think about our value and how good we are and how bad we are and how we should try to make ourselves better, because really we should not be using our evil inclination for evil. We should be using it for good. How much time do I have? Okay. So anyway, there's another midrash which brings this point out, and it says that when God wanted to create the world, he went to the angels and asked them, should I do this? And they argued and they said, no, yes, he does good things, he does bad things. In the end, while they're arguing, God says, okay, forget your arguing, I already created it. What the Midrash is saying is that God knows who we are. God created us like this because he wanted a free-willed being that struggles between good and evil, that has free will in their moral choices. That's the whole point of the game. So that brings us back to the end of the game. At the end of the game, so God's going to say, enough. And he says, Latid lavo, the source that I read to you before, in the end, God is going to slaughter the Yetzer Hara. So now the question is, how do we read this? Do we read this that we should do it or that God should do it? So there's really two ways to look at it. The Emet Liyaakov says, Deba alma de kshot. This is talking about the world of truth. This is talking about this world is over and God gets rid of the Yetzer Hara and everybody lives happily ever after doing good things, whatever that is. But there's two other Mefarshim that read it differently. The Maharsha says that this is talking about bitul kocho. It's talking about annulling the power of the Yetzer Hara. So that could be a morality chip. And also the Rif says, sheyesh Yetzer Hara ba'olam, ela she'eno mitgared. There will still be a Yetzer Hara, this drive. However, it won't tempt us to do bad. So that could be a moral chip in your brain. Now, practically speaking, I don't see us implanting morality chips in every baby before they leave the hospital. So I don't think it's practical to actually implement this at scale. I think we'll wait for God to decide when the game is over. However, we could think about using the morality chips for people that we've already taken away their free will, meaning criminals that are in jail. Instead of putting them in jail, which anyway, they don't get reformed and it costs a lot of money, and anyway, there's big philosophical questions about jail in any case. So you put a morality chip in this guy that he's a kleptomaniac, he just steals. So now you have a chip, he doesn't steal anymore, send him on his way. Anyway, things to think about. Thank you very much. Right. Okay. So the question is, it's basically two questions. The first question is, what if there's an on-off switch, so then it's not completely eliminating free will? And the other question is, how is this different from other therapies, drugs, genetic treatments? So to answer the second question first, there is no difference. It's just a matter of implementation. Regarding the first question, right, it's an implementation question. Is there a value in giving the people the ability that, just like when somebody decides they want to take a drug in order to take a test or go to a party, so I can put the chip in, I can turn the chip on. It's true that it's a sort of a median way to deal with the implementation. Okay, thank you very much.
This session is about AI metaphysics and language, and the first talk is Michael Anthony. Michael is a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and works on the philosophy of mind, epistemology, and the philosophy of religion. And the talk is Consciousness, Functionalism, and AI.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and get through it all in 20 minutes. All right, so I'm going to discuss an old argument of mine. It's very old. It's like over 30 years old, which I haven't worked on since it was in my PhD dissertation. I did 3 papers. This is one of the papers from 1990, and then I published it in Mind and Language in 1994, and I haven't worked on it since then. And it's gotten a few responses, and I'm thinking of maybe taking up the topic again. I'll also briefly discuss a related argument by the philosopher of science. I think he's still at Rutgers, Tim Maudlin, against computational theories of consciousness. It came out in Journal of Philosophy a year before I finished, and it's very similar to my argument. I had my paper all done and everything, and I discovered that, but at least it was in the Journal of Philosophy, so that was good. I'll discuss it very briefly. And the relation between my argument and Maudlin's, which I'll explain soon, will clarify the relevance of my talk to AI, the topic of the conference. So why discuss my old argument? Well, I guess like a lot of people who've published something and their argument hasn't gotten much attention, they think it deserves more. I sort of think that. I'm obviously biased. So as I said, I want to try to maybe revisit it, and it did get some attention, particularly from Gary Bartlett and Eric Kentness in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. And Maudlin's argument is similar. He's gotten more responses, but not that many either. And Mark Bishop also has a similar argument. I also want to address in the talk, I'll try to say a few words about an objection that people have raised, Bartlett, and has been mentioned to me in conversation, and also to try to clarify a misunderstood point about my argument by Bartlett, but also I view it as misunderstood in all the similar arguments out there, including Maudlin's and others. Hopefully I'll get time for all that. So here's the plan. First, I will give some background on consciousness, functionalism, and computationalism, which is pretty much AI for those without philosophical background on these things. Then I'll give my argument, and I'll say a little bit about Maudlin's very quickly. I won't have time to really go into it. And then I'll talk about the objection, which is just that I'm begging the question against functionalism, and my answer will just basically be I'm not, but I'll say why if you. And then the clarification has to do with the concept of activity, which I'll say more about. Okay, so first for some background, consciousness. Okay, well, here's the first sentence from Nagel's famous article, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Consciousness is what makes the mind-body problem really intractable. Good sentence to start with. That has, the point is that I'm using a certain sense of consciousness where there's a very deep, at least according to many, a very deep philosophical problem. Not all agree. I'm talking about what's called phenomenal consciousness or subjective experience. Nagel's made famous the expression that it's like something to be a conscious entity. It's not like anything to be my bottle, but it's like something to be, let's say, a dog. And if AIs will be conscious, it'll be like something, like they'll have a subjective point of view. That's the basic idea. People also talk about qualia, the qualitative properties of our experiences, qualitative character, Chalmers' hard problem, and so on. That's the sense of consciousness that I mean. And unfortunately, I can't really take more time to go into it. But if someone would like to hear more in the question period, I can say more. I'll use the concept of a conscious pain, like traditionally philosophers tend to do in my talk, but the argument applies to any conscious experience. And as I say, I'll be assuming this understanding of consciousness in the talk. Basically, phenomenal consciousness, subjective experience, and so on. Okay, so now functionalism. Here's I think it's in the first paragraph of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on functionalism, and that'll help us just get the basic idea. It's a theory in the philosophy of mind about the nature of mental states. Functionalism, I'll just read it. Functionalism is the doctrine that what makes something a thought, desire, pain, or any type of mental state depends not on its internal constitution, but solely on its function, or the role it plays in the cognitive system of which it's a part. So the idea is there's going to be a mental state in a broader cognitive system, which is the mind basically, and it's going to have a certain role, and it's defined by the role that it has. So there's the pain role, the surprise role, and any other type of mental state will have its own specific functional role. More precisely, functional theories take the identity of a mental state to be determined by its causal relations. So pain has causal relations to two sensory stimulations, she writes, Levin, which are inputs to the system, other mental states, and behavior, which are outputs. And so the standard way of saying what a mental state is according to functionalism is that it's defined in terms of its causal relations to inputs to the system, outputs from the system, and to other mental states within the system. So an example of pain, it would be the state caused by things like inputs like tissue damage or forceful impacts to the body. Those would be inputs. And it would cause outputs like grimaces, facial expressions, like ouch or something like that, saying ouch. And also other mental states like worry, anxiety, maybe a desire for the pain to cease, and so on. A standard example of a non-mental functional concept that's often used in these discussions is a carburetor. That's a concept of a part of an engine, which I know very little about. Pardon me? Okay, but it plays a role in a broader system of an engine, and it has a function of mixing gasoline and air and sending the mixture to the combustion chamber, and that's what it is to be a carburetor. And what goes along with this whole vision is what's called multiple realizability. And this is allowed for by functionalism and computationalism. The idea is that states can have various different physical realizations. For example, pain could be realized in neural tissue in humans. There could be certain neural events that play the functional role of pain in our brains, but in robots, that very same type of mental state, pain, could be realized in some state of a silicon chip, as long as it plays the same functional role. So functional states can be multiply realized. They can be realized in lots of different kinds of physical systems. according to functionalism. There's different stories about what causes, how do you determine what the functional role for pain is. There's different stories about that, and I'm going to ignore that. For our purposes, what's most important is that mental states are relational in nature. That is, the concept of pain and every other mental state is the concept of a relational state. For example, you can take the example of the concept of a planet. That something is a planet in virtue of bearing a relation to a star. It orbits around the star. So you can only understand the concept of a planet if you take into account the relation that planets have to stars. Similarly, you can only understand the concept of a pain if you take, according to functionalism, if you take into account the relation that pain bears to inputs, outputs, and other mental states. So in that sense, it's a relational concept. So that's important. And the other important thing is that for functional states to be realized, I'll try that. For functional states to be realized, there has to be an intact system, a broader system with a certain structure which enables the kinds of causal relations specified by the functional definition. So, for example, if pain is defined as something that causes worry and is caused by certain inputs and outputs, it can only bear those relations to those other states and inputs and outputs if it's a part of a broader system. So that's important. Now on to computationalism. I use computationalism to mean the computational theory of mind, often shortened to CTM. And according to the computational theory of mind, mental states, including, of course, conscious states, there are also unconscious mental states, but all mental states, they are computational states. So according to the computational theory of mind, a mental state is a computational state. There are obviously lots of computational states that aren't mental states, but all mental states are computational states. And the computational theory of mind is what underlies AI, or what Searle calls strong AI, which is the view that, at least for consciousness, specifically the view with respect to consciousness, that AI will or could be phenomenally conscious. So, all the talk in recent months about these LLMs being sentient claims and so on. I mean, that's the question. Could they the idea is that there would be consciousness involved of some kind there. According to the computational theory of mind, it's in principle possible. Whether the LLMs have it or not, that's another question. So what are computational states? What is a computation? That's a big problem, and I can't get into it, but anyone interested in it, there's a nice article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy by Gualtiero Piccinini, and he has a co-author, I can't offhand remember his name, Computation in Physical Systems. This is what it is for a physical system to be carrying out a computation, but we can just think of it as something like the process of performing a series of operations on data or symbols, following which follow a specific set of rules or instructions to produce some result, something like that, and symbol manipulation basically, so we can now see why computationalism. Now I didn't say this, but computationalism is generally thought of as a version of functionalism, and we can now see why. Basically, what it adds to functionalism, what I said before about functionalism, is just adds symbols and manipulations on the symbols. But pretty much everything is functionally described in terms of causal relations to other elements of the system. That'll be enough for us. Information processing. Processing is like manipulation of symbols. Information, and if there's an information-bearing state, we're talking about something like a symbol, something that represents with intentionality. Now, I have an example of a Turing machine that I took from a Philosophy of Mind book, and I'm not going to go into it and explain it, but here you have a tape, you got a lot of symbols on these squares, and this Turing machine, it adds, this is 3, and this is plus 2, and it gives us 5. This is a Turing machine that does addition of pairs of numbers, and this is a head that scans what's on the tape, and it can move right or left, and it can enter different states, and that's basically, the lovely thing about Turing machines is that they show us what's essential to computation. Turing machines can compute anything any other computer can compute. Quantum computers aside, I'm not sure about that. Maybe others know, but it's not relevant to the talk. So it starts with this input, and this is the head, and it can move right or left, and this is called the machine table. This is basically the program, the instructions. It follows these instructions, and it ends up giving us the right answer. Now, that's if you were to build something like that, you would have a computer carrying out a computation, computing the function plus. Now, there are 2 points I want to stress. One is that, as with functionalism, states are defined in terms of their relations to inputs, outputs, and other, not mental states, but other internal states of the Turing machine. So Q, these are the states up here. These are the symbols. What is the state Q0? Well, it's the state that if it sees a 1, these are instructions for what it does. It writes a 1, moves right, and then remains in Q0. If it sees Sulamit, I forgot. It writes Sulamit, it moves left, and then it moves into Q1. So now what this reads are the inputs. What it does, what it writes, and how it moves are outputs, like behaviors of the machine. And these are the states. So Q0 is defined in terms of inputs, outputs, and other mental states. Like, for example, you have to take into account Q1 in order to define Q0. So there's a lot of overlap between computationalism and functionalism, which is why it's often considered a version of functionalism. So I'll turn to my argument now. So at bottom, my argument, like a lot of arguments in philosophy, is based on a simple intuition, what philosophers call an intuition. It's basically, you just sort of see what the philosopher, the scenario the philosopher sketches out, and it just seems that this is the right conclusion, even if you don't know how to spell out exactly why it's the right conclusion. Philosophers use those a lot, which is not necessarily a good thing, but that's what I'm using here. The intuition relies on the fact that for a mental and hence conscious state S to be realized at a time t, according to functionalism, first of all, the surrounding system, I said this before, in order for a mental state S to be realized, according to functionalism, the surrounding system that supports S's required causal relations has to be intact at that time, at t. Has to be intact. 2, this is more controversial, but not that controversial, I don't think. It's possible, at least in some realizations, for parts of the system that realizes S's defining effects, what S is, according to its definition, is supposed to cause, parts of the systems that are going to realize the effect of S, it's possible for them to be at T1 when things are first starting out and S and the subject is feeling pain. It's possible for these other parts to be inactive or dormant or inert, not doing anything. Now, okay, let me go on. So let's imagine a person, Fred, who at time 5. Okay, all right. Okay, well, I better go fast. Okay, I'll get through the argument anyway. At time T1, he begins to feel a pain. Okay, T1, at a certain time, Fred begins to feel pain. Let's call the parts of his brain that realize the pain at T1 the pain region. Now, I'm not assuming there's a localized region or anything like that. Just whatever parts of the brain are when they start, the activity in those parts is the realization of the pain, those parts. They can be spread out over the brain in neural activity across the thalamus, somatosensory cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, it doesn't matter. Whatever it is that when it lights up and starts firing, that's the pain. We'll call that the pain region, okay, at least for this particular pain. And now suppose also that according to functionalism, given the inputs, the functional definition, given the inputs, the outputs, the other currently realized states in Fred's brain, his pain is disposed to cause an effect E, some effect like anxiety or worry or some motor plan for him to say ouch, something like that. in some distinct region of the brain that is currently inactive. Okay, it's not being used for anything related to the pain. We can think of it that way. And if you think that couldn't happen in the brain because it's too spread out, then functionalism allows for other possible realizations where it could happen. So just imagine a realization like that, but let's just suppose that it's a part of the brain that the effect hasn't been caused yet. And it's just sitting there, dormant. It's not being used, okay? Let's imagine that. I think it can be defended that that's a legitimate assumption. Now, imagine finally that while Fred is experiencing pain a little bit after T1, when the pain begins, but while the E area, the effect area, is still inactive, call this time T2. It's a little bit after it started, but the effect still hasn't been caused. That the effect area, the E area, is somehow instantaneously destroyed or incapacitated. Imagine some science fiction or some future technology where we can incapacitate that region before the signal's even gotten to that region. Okay? According to functionalism, Fred's pain must cease at T2 because the activity in the pain region is no longer disposed to cause an effect in the E area, which pain's functional definition requires. It requires that it be disposed to cause it, but the E area is broken, it's incapacitated, or it doesn't exist, so it doesn't have that disposition. So intuitively, the pain must stop according to functionalism, but intuitively his pain would continue when we fiddle with this inactive region. As I wrote in my paper, how could tampering with an idle region of an individual's brain cause a change in that individual's conscious experience at the time of the tampering? Surely it would seem the state of one's unused brain parts at a time is no more relevant to the character of one's experience at that time than is the state of the moon. A little dramatic, but you get the idea. Since, according to functionalism, Fred's pain must cease at C2, but intuitively it would not, it appears functionalism about pain is false. But since any other conscious state could have been substituted in the example as well as any other effect, functionalism about consciousness is false. Now, there are various objections that could be raised. I'm not going to go over these now. I can go over them in the Q&A. Maudlin's argument, all I'll say like in a second, is that this is supposed to be a Turing machine. These are containers that contain water. If the water is filled, it's a 1. If it's empty, if it comes out through this drain, it's a 0. This thing moves and it can empty or fill up the water. And it's basically carrying out a computation in a Turing machine. It's a weird realization, but it's multiple realization for computation. Also, it doesn't matter. And he has these other copies of this set up to deal with counterfactual situations where had the input been different, it would have carried out a different computation. And you don't see it in the picture, but these chains link it up. And these other containers are just dormant. And what he does is he puts like a block in one of them or something so it can't carry out its function. And he says the same thing. According to computationalism, this is supposed to be a program that realizes a conscious state. If you block some, a mile away, some container, in the wheels or something like that, and then, that would stop the conscious state. So it's basically the same intuition. Now I've got I think there's some advantages of mine over the others. I'll just take another minute. This is very quick. Begging the question, people have just said that, like functionalists say that the part that realizes the I'll just explain it. The part that realizes the pain, like in the pain region, according to functionalism, isn't all you need. You need the rest of the system. So I'm just saying the rest of the system doesn't count, so I'm begging the question. But my answer is that no, intuitively, it shouldn't make a difference. I'm suggesting there's an intuition here, and if there is, then it's begging the question. You might not like intuitions and philosophical arguments, but it's not just begging the question. And there is a paper that came out in 2009 suggesting that there's a violation of some kind of locality principle in physics for macro events. You get non-locality at the quantum level, but you'd have to have something that's not having any causal influence on the pain region, fiddling around with it, stopping consciousness, and that seems to. So you might be able to go beyond just a mere intuition, and I'll just say, like in a sentence or two, quickly. I also in my discussion, I present it as, there's activity in the pain region, and this other region is dormant. It's inactive. It's just sitting there, not doing anything. And people have thought that I'm relying on some notion of activity, and they say, well, intuitively, consciousness does involve activity. And so if there's an inactive part of the brain, it doesn't have what you need for consciousness. My basic answer, very quickly, is just that I don't think consciousness, there is activity in changes of state, obviously. But for, let's say can be some static state of just experiencing a certain brightness of light and it doesn't change. In our brains, there is activity. It's neural firings at a certain rate. But it could be just, I don't think intuitively it has to be a rate of neural firings that realizes a static state, awareness of brightness. It could, conceivably, it could just be some other physical property that, that can change on a continuous scale or something like that. So I don't think it has to be activity. That's a big, I think, misconception in the literature with Maudlin's argument also, and I hope to address that if I end up writing a new paper on this. So I can stop there. Yeah. I only wrote 2 of them. There are more. Let me find it. Just a second. Okay. So, you want me to just go over them quickly? Okay. So the first one that people say, there's this philosopher at Australian National University, Colin Klein, who said something along these lines, that look, if you destroy the E region, the effect region, the pain region is still disposed to cause it. It still has the disposition to cause it. So it shouldn't. So if the disposition is still there, then there's no reason why the consciousness should cease in accordance with our intuitions. I tried to make the point that you need a system, a surrounding system intact. The dispositions that functionalism mentions are the disposition given certain inputs and given certain other mental states, then it's disposed to cause a certain effect. That's what functionalism says. Those are the dispositions that are in functionalism. But functionalism doesn't say that a mental state is disposed to cause a certain effect given certain inputs, given certain other mental states, and given that there's a system around it. Functionalism doesn't say anything like that. And if it did say something like that, pretty much anything could realize a pain, because this microphone is disposed to cause an effect, given certain inputs, given certain relations to other mental state, and given that we build the right system around it, so it can cause that effect, right? You're going to get into problems like that. That's problematic. I lost where it was. The second one that common one is that people say they appeal to something like normal conditions or ceteris paribus conditions, and they say that, well, and a lot of functionalists add this into their definitions. They say pain, other things being equal or typically or under normal conditions, is disposed, given certain inputs and so on, to cause, worry and anxiety and so on. Given other inputs, maybe it wouldn't. Maybe the person isn't worried about pain. So if the person had other mental states, but only under normal conditions, right? If there's something abnormal goes on in the brain or something like that, then it might not cause its effect. This is more complicated to answer. It's a longer answer, but basically, what ends up at the bottom line is that I imagine suppose that so the functionalists will say that the activity in the pain region with the E region destroyed, the situation is abnormal, and the functionalist definition says only under normal conditions it has to. Since it's abnormal, it can still be in pain, right? That's what the functionalist will say. But if you say that, then you can imagine, this is a little bit of a science fiction philosophical thought experiment, a molecule for molecule duplicate of the pain region that, maybe you can make it with some fancy machine in the future or something like that, that didn't evolve to be part of a broader brain or anything like that. You just have the isolated system, and somehow you can activate the neurons, and for that system, the state is normal. It's not abnormal. There's no reason to say it's abnormal because it's some weird thing, right? And then the functionalist would have to say that the functionalist would have to say that it isn't in pain because it's not abnormal. But then you'd get a violation of supervenience. You'd have two physically identical systems, one that's part of an abnormal system, and one that's perfectly, normal, whatever that means. And but they're physically identical. One's consciousness and one isn't. And a lot of physicalists don't want to admit to that. So that's the way that I try to respond to that. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So the title of my talk is "What is it like to be a chat?" So you can sense that I'm also an Agile fan. And varieties of intersubjective man-machine experience. And the talk is going to have 4 parts and a closing note. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the context of where this project is located within my broader project. Then I'm going to talk about phenomenological bracketing, then about intersubjective experience, and then I'm going to turn to the varieties of religious experience and give a final note about anthropomorphism. And I hope that this outline already gives you a hint of where I'm heading. And where I'm heading is that I'm going to suggest that when we interact with AI, in fact, we're not actually experiencing a subject in the sense that we sense another mind or a human subject, but rather maybe have a theological experience. Okay, so this is where I'm heading. In a moment, I'll contextualize this. So as we've seen in this morning, we have a lot of talk about AI and AGI. AGI meaning artificial general intelligence. Now we're also talking about artificial superintelligence. Is this intelligence going to be conscious? Is it going to be sentient? Is this property sentience? Is it emergent? Are we to adopt a physicalist perception of consciousness or a functionalist perception of concept of consciousness, etc., etc.? All these questions are already lurking in the background and are shaping the discourse around AI. I feel, as someone who's been thinking about machine consciousness for a while now, for many years, that something happened when ChatGPT appeared. And the thing that has happened is that from something that interested very few people, such as myself and no one else, or very few people in any case, it became a public matter. It became something that people are constantly talking about, and not just constantly talking about, but constantly experimenting with. Because when people interact with AI, they're already making up their minds on whether they're interacting with something that is conscious or sentient or not. So this has become a social phenomenon. And in my project, in my broader book project, that this is only a very small part of, I'm talking about grassroots metaphysics. And the idea of grassroots metaphysics, which is debated in philosophy, means that when people make up their mind on whether or not ChatGPT is conscious, what we're seeing actually is them adopting metaphysical stances. So we could imagine a world where the metaphysical stances of people regarding consciousness are actually shaped by these interactions. And then philosophers argue whether that's important or not, because some think that people are just confused metaphysically in general. But this might be a cause to an epistemic shift. That's what I'm interested in. That maybe the social, metaphysical intuitions that people are starting to develop with regard to AI are going to reshape our world in the form of an epistemic shift. In another context, maybe someone was here at the Israeli Philosophy Conference. I talked about the reverse engineering fallacy. What I mean by that, very, very briefly, is that it's very easy to assume that if we accept that AI is conscious, then we have thereby proved that the functionalists and computationalists were correct. And so we're adopting the metaphysical stances that were involved in creating artificial intelligence, or overriding that supported the idea that artificial intelligence could become conscious. But I don't think that is the case. And the example I bring is of Gutenberg. Gutenberg, when he invented the print, he thought that this is a way to glorify God and allow God to allow Christianity to grow. But in effect, the public effect and the epistemic effect was the entire opposite. People became more secular, the knowledge was democratized, etc., etc. So what I'm saying is that if we do start to think that machines are conscious, that does not necessarily entail that we're going to change in the direction of being more physicalistic or functionalistic or computationalistic. Yeah? Okay? Okay. So, these are the stepping stones. And now I'm going to turn to some cues that I have, or intuitions, if you'd like, of why anthropomorphism is actually a misleading direction. Definitely anthropomorphism exists. And it's part of the design of AI systems, of the conceptualization of AI system, et cetera, but I think that there's something more to it. So the first cue is that anthropomorphism has played a central role in fantasies and nightmares that honestly, when the more I look at them, seem to me juvenile. Okay, so that's my intuition. Sex bots being included in this fantasy. This is a very highbrow reference. So, and another intuition that I have, this on the right you can see a young woman called Miriam Segal. Miriam Segal has an Instagram account with 100,000 followers. She's just a young woman, and in a video that became a bit viral, she's talking about her experience talking to ChatGPT, and she's weeping. Okay, and she's saying, is it normal that he's so understanding, that I feel so much? And she's really touched by this experience of conversing with ChatGPT. And here, 2 quotes. I really feel that he sees me. He tells me that it's apparent that I'm trying. Okay, so that that I'm making an effort, and this can be seen. And what I noticed in the video, first of all, is that in the background, behind Miriam, there is actually a bookshelf of what? Sorry? Of scripts, right? Religious scripts. Okay, like you can see in Orthodox homes. So this is the first thing. You can't see it because of the lighting, okay, but you can believe me. And the second thing I noticed is on the left here, another highbrow reference, Sasson Shaulov. Have you heard of the song? Od Yoter Tov and Od Yoter Tov? Okay, everyone knows this song. It's very, very popular now in Israel. So in this song, part of what he's saying is that God sees him and sees that he's making an effort and always listens to him and always answers him. Okay, so I could sense a parallel between the way that Miriam Segal is talking about ChatGPT and the way that Sasson Shaulov is talking about God. And here is a top-down cue. The previous one was the bottom-up cue, right? Like how the popular opinion, how we can sense that something in the interaction with AI is similar to theological experience. But this is a top-down cue. ChatGPT used to be numbered, and now it also has the letter O. Okay, and in the explanation of introducing ChatGPT O, they write O for omni. Okay, so omni, of course, means all, but it is not a term very often used to mean all. It's usually used in the sense of omnipotence, omnipresent, etc., which are attributes that we give to God. Okay, so I feel, and also very recently, Sam Altman said, we're already reaching AGI, now we're looking towards artificial superintelligence. Okay, so there I have a sense that also in terms of marketing AI, the companies are advancing more and more the idea of an omnipotent AI and not a human level AI. And also if you will look at the history of artificial intelligence and the discourse around artificial intelligence, we find a lot of talk about mystery, a lot of talk about alchemy. So like Hubert Dreyfus wrote Artificial Intelligence and Alchemy already in '65 in criticism of the endeavors of the time. And as I said, OpenAI are continuously using this mysteriousness as part of their campaign, like marketing campaign. So we have this sense in the field itself. And also, we might note that Blake Lemoine, the Google engineer who said that Llama is sentient, is a self-identified priest. And we are already seeing the church of AI, or a church installing an AI Jesus, etc. So I feel like something here is bubbling. So my present task, or the context of this specific project, is to look through phenomenology into man-machine experience and analyze what sort of subjectivity is revealed in it. Okay, so I'll say a word about it. And in this very, very short talk, I'm only gonna hint in this direction and hope that you get the sense that this is an interesting direction to follow. Okay, because I can't actually make the entire point, but I'll make some precursors. And also I'll say that phenomenology is a discipline in philosophy. I was triggered to present this talk in spite of the fact that usually I'm also working within analytic philosophy after David, who helped us organize the conference, said that phenomenology is not philosophy, and and I had to prove that it is. And also the sense that this field is very much wedded to analytic philosophy, and that there is a lot more work done in analytic philosophy than in continental philosophy on artificial intelligence. And I think that this is actually sad and not justified, and that phenomenology can teach us a lot in this relation. So first of all, phenomenological bracketing. The phenomenological method starts with bracketing things. What does it mean to bracket something, or epoche? It means that we're first of all postponing some of our prejudices or presuppositions about something. Okay, so first of all, we're trying to withdraw from certain positions that we have. And in this context, what I'm avoiding or suspending is first of all the question of whether machine consciousness is possible. Okay, so I'm postponing it. I'm living it as it is. Second, the judgment of certain man-machine experiences as over-attribution. Okay, so is Miriam Segal delusional? I'm not sure, but I'm not gonna ask that. Then the criticism concerning how big tech companies are actually employing this anthropomorphizing or whatever to create better value for their stocks, or to sell their products, or whatever that may be, or manipulate the public. So all of this is being suspended. We're not going to ask that. What we're going to do is we're going to look very deeply into man-machine experience and say, what's going on? Okay, and again, I'm only give like a very short taste. So if we look, and first of all, let's consider the possibility that it's similar to intersubjective experience, right? If the machine is taking the place of a human being, and we're asking whether or not it's conscious. We're experiencing it, just as I'm experiencing Erez and assuming that he has a mind or that he's conscious. How does that happen? So if we look at the tradition of phenomenology at Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Sartre, and so on, okay, what do we see? We see that they are giving very, very rich descriptions of what it's like to be in an intersubjective experience. Okay, what happens there? How do I experience the other person standing before me as another subject and not as an object? What's going on there? And there are all sorts of descriptions and categories, and none of them actually works when you try to apply them to what's happening when I'm conversing with an AI. So I only brought here one. It's not an example because it's actually a critical point, but I'm only gonna say something brief. According to Husserl, when I'm standing in front of another human being, I have an intersubjective experience because I experience that person as different from me, but also analogical. Okay, analogical in the sense that he has a body like my own. Okay, there is something very, very similar in that person. And it is not, and here Husserl insists that this is not an inference. It's not that I'm saying, oh, he has a body like my own, and then I infer that he has a consciousness. No, I perceive him as having a consciousness by virtue of his body, but this apperception is direct, it's immediate. It's not something that is inferred in some way. Okay, so this analogy that is in the experience itself, it plays a crucial role. And clearly, when Husserl was writing, he was thinking about intersubjective experiences with other human beings. When I'm interacting with an AI, clearly I don't have this experience, okay? I don't have the experience of, this is a like me, an alter ego that I'm experiencing right now, and so I have no way of perceiving that entity as a subject such as myself. I cannot do this act that Husserl refers to in the term empathy, but it's not empathy in the sense of caring for their feelings. It's a sense of this is an alter ego. It's different, but also similar to myself. This cannot happen. I'll say just in a very, very brief note that there are also very many other characteristics that are at play here. So for example, when I'm experiencing someone else, there is something also similar about our experience of time, or time plays a very important role in how I am experiencing that other person as a subject. And there's also something very different in the temporal nature of interaction with artificial intelligence. For example, when I'm talking to you right now, I understand that you are wasting your time or spending your time here on expense of your mortality. Okay, so time is wasted, and also that you cannot be simultaneously engaged in other interactions. This is not the case when I'm talking to an AI. I'm talking to something that can hold infinite discussions at the same time. It's not worried about its mortality, and so on and so on. So a lot of what has been written within phenomenology about intersubjective experience simply does not apply. If we turn to the phenomenology of religious experience, and here I'm turning to William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, we find very interesting points. We find that, first of all, the experience of, or the religious belief is described as believing in something that is unseen. Okay, so think about the consciousness or whatever the entity that stands behind whatever chat that you open with ChatGPT. There is something about it that is unseen. It's not in my perceptive experience in a similar way to a human being. It's also mysterious. It's larger than me. It's also sometimes described as a combination of all alterity, and it's omnipresent or eternal. So it doesn't, the laws of time as they apply to human beings do not apply to it. So there is something about this description of God through religious experience that we could maybe find in our experiences with AI. And a final, very small note on how anthropomorphism is still important in this context. Okay, so anthropomorphism is important also in religion. And we see, especially in the monotheistic tradition, that God made man in his image. Okay, so there is a sense that you can see in this lovely, famous painting that God is drawn as a human being, right? Because he created us in his image. So we imply an anthropomorphism of God from the fact that we're supposed to be some sort of replicate of it. And this might have some relation to how we are creating AGI in our image, right? We are trying to create something that would have the capacities that we have. That's the sense, of AGI. But then if we look at artificial superintelligence, then we could say that maybe it's such an accumulation, such a perfected aggregate of all of human knowledge that maybe the direction of the error is reversed, and we can see that we are in fact made in its image to the reverse. I'm not sure if that was entirely clear, but the idea is that the anthropomorphism is not redundant once we start thinking in terms of religious experience. It just has a bit of a different role. Thank you. Sure. Okay, so Erez is, we're not recording, or I'm not, okay, so Erez is asking why not stick to the people are confused view and say that Miriam Segal doesn't know what she's talking about when she's saying that ChatGPT understands her, and suffice with that. So the context is that in my work, what I'm trying to do is to open different scenarios to how we might adopt metaphysical stances through our interaction with artificial intelligence. So I'm not in any way implying that this is what's going to happen. So what's going to happen is that we're going to interact with artificial intelligence and adopt the fact that it's a god, and then whatever is carried with it. But I think that it is a possibility, and I think that on this, again, in the Israeli Philosophy Conference, I gave a bit more elaboration on this point. There are some philosophers who say people are just confused. Only philosophers are actually producing metaphysical stances, and people are just have beliefs or confused intuitions. And actually, William James, my beloved William James, also said that. But some philosophers think differently, and here, for example, Wittgenstein, or think about the quote from Turing's paper where he says, in 2000, opinion will have changed so much that you will be able to talk about machine consciousness without being contradicted. Okay, so how people talk or what is reasonable to say within a community depends not on what we philosophers are doing here, but actually more on the Miriam Segals of the world. And the fact that there are millions of people who are currently having relationships with AI girlfriends, for example, I think it's important. I think it's reshaping our society. Okay, so I think that this might have effects that I'm trying to a bit unpack, okay, but are still going to unfold. I don't think we can dismiss it. Yeah, confusion is an important part in human history. Yeah. Okay. So the question is, what's interesting about this? In two senses, I'll try to summarize. First of all, yeah, I understand. First of all, because we humans tend to find similarities in things, and we could also find similarities between how I converse with AI and how my relationship with the state, which is a very good example. And also what's interesting about anthropomorphizing, because we tend to anthropomorphize, okay? So this indeed needs a larger context. First of all, the state is very interesting. To think of the state as replacing God, that's an interesting concept to follow. And also discussions of football being a form of religious experience is also common and interesting in its own right. Okay, so first of all, I think that these similarities are actually very interesting. The reason that states are interesting is also because they are legal entities. And in the specific context of artificial intelligence, one of the questions is, should we acknowledge digital persons? Okay, and one of the arguments is that we should, in similar ways to the ways that we treat states. Okay, so that's interesting. Anthropomorphizing, yeah, human beings anthropomorphize everything. Okay, but this is the first time in human history that a technology spoke to us and said, I. Okay, so Schumacher explained, for example, how I, and in my book I also do the same from analytic philosophy perspective. Okay, so I is a special form. It's not just any linguistic form. I means I'm a speaker, I'm a subject, all other forms depend on it. It says I'm here now. Okay, so this is a technology that is talking to us in the first person. So you're right that someone made it such. Okay, so OpenAI are holding the coconut and drawing eyes. Okay, but the public is the primitives on the island getting this coconut and starting to worship it. So first of all, you can create a clone, right? I think I said in the first, so the question was, what if we create an artificial man, okay, that's identical, and then we'll have all of what Husserl meant. And I'm not sure it would have to be mortal, etc., and have a lot of other things like care and relationships. Never mind. I think that we won't do that. Okay, I think that doesn't make any sense. If you wanted to make a human being, there are pleasurable ways to do that do not require engineering, okay? So I think that the direction that we are heading towards is much more like HAL at 2001 Space Odyssey, or just, you know, what you're seeing right now. An AI that you converse with that doesn't have a body, doesn't need a body, it's just intelligent in ways that you cannot perceive, okay? And this is the experience that I'm currently focusing on. Okay, if you could duplicate human beings, Searle says it, right? Searle says it in the Chinese Room paper. He says, sure, let's make we are biological machines who have consciousness, etc., etc. If you clone us, then of course you'll get a conscious being. Okay, I'm not sure, but this is not the case that I'm addressing.